Peter Baelish had always prided himself on his ability to anticipate the twists and turns in the grand chessboard of Westeros. From a modest birth in the Vale, he had risen to a position of quiet power, never claiming a crown for himself, yet shaping who might wear one. But the realm had grown chaotic, riddled with the shadows of White Walkers, the flames of dragons, and the ambition of would-be kings and queens. And Peter Baelish felt the tremors of that changing world. He sensed that the game he had played for so long had reached a different stage, where swords weren't enough and cunning alone might no longer suffice. He needed an ally like no other. Someone unstoppable, fearsome, mesmerizing, and above all, someone he could subtly guide. That was what brought him across the narrow sea. He arrived in Meereen under the cover of night, slipping through the city's gates with a small band of hired guards. Though Daenerys Targaryen had declared herself the breaker of chains, the unburnt, the mother of dragons, and myriad other titles, she had opened her doors to envoys, travelers, and ambassadors. Littlefinger played the part of one more supplicant from Westeros, begging an audience with the Dragon Queen. Yet Peter had no intention of prostrating himself like a craven. He stepped into Daenerys's throne room, though it was still more modest than any royal hall in Westeros, and observed the way torches lit the great harpy pillars, vestiges of the old slaver culture. Across the chamber, Daenerys Targaryen sat on a carved seat. Not quite the Iron Throne, but it was still a seat of power. Her silver-gold hair was braided away from her face. Ser Barristan Selmy, ever the loyal knight, stood near her right side, and Missandei hovered close, silent but watchful. Tyrion Lannister, newly serving as the Queen's hand, observed Peter with narrowed eyes. With measured steps, Peter approached the Queen. He presented himself with the usual pleasantries, a courteous bow, an elaborately woven excuse for his presence, and a reference to mutual acquaintances, Tyrion, for one, who had once tasted the cunning of Peter Baelish. Tyrion stood not far from Daenerys now, arms crossed, brow furrowed. It was no secret that Daenerys already had her closest advisors: Tyrion, Missandei, Grey Worm, and Ser Jorah Mormont. But Tyrion knew Peter. He knew the reputation, the sly manipulations that had shaped the War of the Five Kings. He quietly urged Daenerys to hear Peter out. The Dragon Queen glanced at Tyrion, then nodded, granting Littlefinger a brief time to speak. Peter Baelish spoke of the condition of Westeros, of the looming threat in the north, of the unrest in the Riverlands, of the manipulations of Cersei Lannister in King's Landing. He wore a carefully modulated expression, the semblance of sincere concern. He told Daenerys about the Vale, about House Aaron's precarious position, about the hidden loyalties that could be tapped once she set foot in Westeros. He served up the idea that the Vale might fold itself beneath her banner, provided the Queen recognized the strategic advantage of such an alliance. Tyrion's knowing eyes studied Littlefinger as if he were a spider, weaving new webs. "You speak of forging an alliance, Lord Baelish," said Tyrion, voice tinged with skepticism. "Yet you do so without any official seal. I know your talents well enough to suspect you also come seeking something." "If knowledge is a crime, Lord Tyrion," Peter replied smoothly, "then all men who read books or whisper in halls are guilty. I do come seeking something, yes. I seek what will benefit the Vale naturally, and if it should benefit me as well, who can blame a man for that?" He paused, letting the mild flattery settle in. "I bring you the Vale, or at least the strong possibility of its allegiance. Its knights are some of the best in Westeros. In return, I ask only for a voice in your councils and the goodwill of the future Queen of the Seven Kingdoms." He sensed Daenerys's curiosity, saw the flicker in her violet eyes. She was young but not a naive fool. She had navigated the politics of Astapor, Yunkai, Meereen, and the Dothraki. She might be forging something better than slavery and tyranny, but she was no stranger to cunning. Her dragons had taught the city-states of Essos the price of underestimating her. But Westeros was a different game, and Peter Baelish was the type of man who had thrived in the heart of that game. Missandei waited quietly for her queen's word, while Ser Barristan eyed Peter with unease. Jorah Mormont, returned from exile and healed of grayscale, was equally wary. Daenerys spoke, her tone regal yet curious. "I am not short of advisors, Lord Baelish. Why do I need you specifically?" Littlefinger bowed once more, just enough to show respect without compromising his pride. "Because I know the players in Westeros, your grace. I have guided some of them. I have had them in my debt. I have orchestrated alliances and betrayals. I know where secrets are buried. Secrets that even those in your council might be unaware of. If I am correct, you plan to sail for Westeros soon. When you land, it would benefit you greatly to have a man who can help you navigate the labyrinth of intrigues and loyalties." He could see the wheels turning in Tyrion's mind. The dwarf had once occupied the role of Master of Coin under King Joffrey. He knew Peter's old seat, the black ledgers, the hidden finances that had funded the crown. Moreover, Tyrion had no illusions about Peter's moral compass. But if they could use him rather than fight him, that might be more beneficial for Daenerys in the short term. Daenerys shifted in her chair. "Very well, Lord Baelish. You shall have a place here for the time being. But betray me, and I will not hesitate to feed you to my dragons." The corner of Littlefinger's lips curled in a faint smirk. "I understand perfectly, your grace." And so began an alliance that no one had anticipated. In the weeks that followed, Peter Baelish ingratiated himself with Daenerys's retinue. He observed how she commanded her Unsullied and the Dothraki hordes she had brought with her across the sea. He paid special attention to her dragons, Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion, recognizing that they were living weapons far more valuable than any coin or political arrangement. He studied the others in her camp, from the fearless Grey Worm to the stalwart Dothraki blood riders. He probed at Missandei's knowledge of languages and her background as a former slave, gleaning how devotion had been won by Daenerys's empathy and justice. Tyrion kept a close eye on Littlefinger, mindful of how easily the man had navigated King's Landing, sown discord, and reaped power from chaos. Even Tyrion, however, found it difficult to pinpoint Peter's exact agenda. Sometimes, guards spotted Peter speaking to the captains of the Unsullied, presumably to learn about their logistical needs. Other times, he was seen conversing quietly with the Dothraki Kos, careful to show them respect in their own language. He rarely missed an opportunity to talk with the freedmen of Meereen, listening to their tales of life after liberation. His curiosity extended to the stables, the blacksmith's forge, the tailors. He wanted a complete picture of Daenerys's domain, from the most powerful to the most humble. All knowledge was currency. But despite his subtle machinations, Peter began to realize Daenerys Targaryen was not like the lords and ladies of Westeros. She had a moral conviction that, while it could be manipulated, also endowed her with a strength few possessed. She was not interested in personal profit so much as in justice and the welfare of the realm she hoped to rule. It was an alien concept to him, yet it also made her dangerously appealing. Such a leader could inspire fanatical devotion, and if he could harness that, he might find a way to keep shaping the future of the Seven Kingdoms to his advantage. He found himself admiring her, perhaps in a manner that went beyond calculation. Finally, the day came when Daenerys declared her intent to depart for Westeros. Ships were gathered, many purchased through Tyrion's cunning, others pledged by loyalists in Essos who believed in the breaker of chains. The Dothraki loaded their horses onto large vessels for the first time in their lives, uneasy about the open sea but fueled by their devotion to their Khaleesi. The Unsullied marched onto ships in perfect formation, disciplined even amid the chaos of departing a city. Daenerys left the rule of Meereen to a council of freedmen and sympathetic former nobles, trusting in them to uphold the peace. Before stepping onto the ship that would carry him back to Westeros, Peter gazed at the harbor. He considered how drastically his life had changed from the days when he had only a single small boat to his name, ferrying him from King's Landing to the Vale. Now he stood at the threshold of a new conquest, with a queen who commanded 3 dragons. The golden eyes of Tyrion Lannister watched him from the side, ensuring he made no sudden treacherous moves. The voyage was eventful only in how many small alliances and rivalries it seeded. Peter, given space on one of the larger vessels, found himself invited to dine with Daenerys, Tyrion, Missandei, and Grey Worm on occasion. He was careful to present himself as a witty conversationalist, harmless enough to be accepted, but also quietly intimidating in his knowledge. He sparred verbally with Tyrion about the intricacies of Westerosi history, dropped hints about rumors of secret Targaryen supporters in the Vale, mentioned the resentment among certain northern houses toward House Bolton. Through these subtle revelations, he painted a portrait of a realm in flux, one that would be ripe for Daenerys' arrival. They landed first on Dragonstone, the ancestral seat of House Targaryen, recently abandoned by Stannis Baratheon. The fortress was imposing, perched high atop the volcanic rock. It still bore the carvings of dragons and Targaryen heraldry. The moment Daenerys set foot on its black shores, it felt as though destiny itself guided her. She knelt in the sand, let the cold sea breeze tangle her hair, and silently drank in the sight of her family's castle. Peter watched her from a respectful distance, calculating the significance of the moment. The Great Hall of Dragonstone would become her war room, from which she planned to march on the Seven Kingdoms. Tyrion and Varys, who had rejoined Daenerys from a prior mission, immediately began scouring the castle's halls, taking stock of supplies, living quarters, and the extensive dragonglass deposits rumored to lie beneath. Grey Worm and the Unsullied secured the fortress with practiced efficiency, ensuring no hidden foe remained. The Dothraki, though uneasy with stone walls and cold skies, made their camps near the beach, their horses stamping and snorting. Littlefinger presented himself for a private audience soon after they settled in. He bowed before Daenerys in the war room, though his eyes flicked toward the intricate carved map of Westeros. He suppressed a smile, remembering how Stannis had once used this very table. "Your Grace," he began, voice smooth as the tide, "I bring word from my correspondences in the Vale. They are aware of your landing. Lord Yohn Royce and other lords respect the Targaryen name, even if some do so grudgingly. They remain uncertain of whether to support you openly, but they fear the Lannisters. If we play our cards correctly, the Vale can be yours without bloodshed." Daenerys regarded him carefully, her hands resting on the cold stone edge of the table. "And what exactly do you want in return, Lord Baelish?" "The Vale is not yours to barter if its lords do not wish it." A faint chuckle escaped him. "My lady, I have been the voice behind the young Lord Arryn for some time. Sweet Robin looks upon me as an uncle, practically his only guide since his mother's demise. With the right incentives, the Vale lords would rally their knights to your cause. In exchange, I might ask for some recognition for my role in uniting the Vale under your banner." She tilted her head, pale hair cascading. "Do you seek a title? Gold? Lands? None of those things would displease me, but more than any of that, I desire a place in the realm's future that ensures prosperity and protection for my interests. When you take the Iron Throne, it would be wise to have a man who understands the realm's finances, the labyrinth of debts, incomes, and alliances. Tyrion may serve you in many ways, but managing the entire realm is a gargantuan task. Perhaps, in time, I might prove worthy of regaining the title of Master of Coin." Daenerys' face remained impassive. "Tyrion holds that title, and I value his counsel highly." Littlefinger inclined his head, not bothering to hide a thin smile. "I do not mean to supplant your hand, merely to assist him or to be used as you see fit." Daenerys let the silence hang, glancing briefly at Tyrion who stood behind her, arms folded. Then she returned her gaze to Peter. "We shall see if your loyalty holds. Bring the Vale to my side, and we shall speak again of titles." The conversation ended on that note. Peter withdrew, feeling the tension that always simmered between him and Tyrion. The imp was no fool. He knew Peter's aim was to reclaim influence that had once been stripped from him, albeit subtly. But he also knew that Daenerys was forging a different path. Her moral code, her sense of justice, and her desire to break the wheel that had long crushed the people of Westeros. She might not be swayed by the same levers of greed and ambition as other monarchs, but he had faith in his cunning. Every leader, no matter how noble, needed something. If he could offer it at the right moment, he would secure his place. A few nights later, a raven arrived from the north with dire news of White Walkers marching south. Jon Snow, the king in the north, had sought to warn Daenerys of the threat beyond the wall. The Stark bastard, no, the Stark king, Peter corrected himself, insisted that the realm's survival depended on unity against the army of the dead. Daenerys, upon reading the note, grew thoughtful. Word had already reached her that Cersei Lannister clutched desperately to power in King's Landing, but the North faced its own apocalypse. Torn between her goal of claiming the Iron Throne and the need to confront this ancient threat, Daenerys consulted her closest advisors. Unsurprisingly, Tyrion and Varys advised caution, though Ser Davos, newly arrived from the north, argued passionately for an alliance. Peter seized the moment. He requested an audience, stepping into the war room where Daenerys and her senior advisors debated. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "forgive my intrusion, but I could offer some insight. While the threat in the north is real, you cannot ignore the hold Cersei has on the capital. If you march north without dealing with the Lannisters, you risk losing ground here in the south. But if you move against Cersei first, you risk allowing the army of the dead to grow stronger. There must be a more subtle approach." Tyrion frowned. "You think we can simply parley with the Lannisters? Cersei would never willingly yield." Peter spread his hands. "She would not yield, no. But if you offer a temporary truce, an armistice to face a common enemy, perhaps Cersei's thirst for survival could be leveraged. She might pay lip service to the idea, buying you time to verify the threat in the north, and then you can gather your forces accordingly. At the same time, you can still strengthen your foothold here. There is also the possibility of forging ties with the king in the north. The Vale Lords would be more inclined to side with Daenerys if they see the north aligning with her." Daenerys's expression darkened. She did not trust the Lannisters, nor did she relish any idea that allowed Cersei more time to breathe. But the mention of forging ties with Jon Snow appealed to her sense of uniting Westeros. She stepped away from the table, gazing out of the war room's window. The sea crashed against Dragonstone's rocky shores, a tempest that reflected her own inner turmoil. Finally, she turned. "I will send a message to Jon Snow, inviting him to Dragonstone. Let him tell me about the threat in the north himself. Meanwhile, we must also prepare for a potential confrontation with the Lannisters." Tyrion and Varys nodded in agreement, though the tension in the air did not dissipate. Peter offered a shallow bow. "As you wish, Your Grace." When Jon Snow eventually arrived, the tension between him and Daenerys was palpable. She demanded he bend the knee, but he refused, insisting his only goal was to save the North from the impending doom. Peter watched from the sidelines, noticing the flickers of intrigue, how Daenerys looked at Jon Snow with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity, how Tyrion tried to mediate. Daenerys's dragons circled overhead, roaring, imposing the might of House Targaryen upon the brooding king in the north. In hushed corners of the castle, Peter whispered into the ears of lords from the Vale who had accompanied him. He offered them a vision, a realm united under a dragon queen who valued justice, backed by knights who had historically been overshadowed by the Lannisters and Baratheons. He reminded them that the Starks were not known for cunning, but for honor, an attribute that might be beneficial when forging alliances. He fanned flickers of doubt, too, implying that the Lannisters and the Boltons had both betrayed the Vale's trust in the past. Now was the time to stand behind a Targaryen, or risk being left in the cold. Word soon reached Dragonstone that Euron Greyjoy had attacked Yara Greyjoy's fleet, crippling Daenerys' naval power. Cersei had also leveraged a grand show of force in King's Landing, forging new alliances with the re-emerging Iron Fleet. Daenerys grew frustrated. The war for the Iron Throne looked grim, and the White Walkers loomed ever closer. Jon Snow pressed her to use her dragons against the army of the dead, while Tyrion strategized how to break Cersei's hold in the south. Baelish observed that Daenerys' frustration was a dangerous fuel. She had the power to destroy entire armies with dragonfire, but the moral compass that guided her also restrained her. She refused to become like her father, the Mad King, who would have burned cities. Peter saw an opening. He could be the advisor who urged her toward a more measured approach, while still ensuring she used her might decisively. If he handled it well, he could secure her gratitude, maybe even her trust. One afternoon, while Daenerys was perched on the high walls of Dragonstone, staring at the narrow sea, Peter approached. She did not turn at first, her gaze locked on the horizon. "The dragons, they can sense my anger," she said, almost to herself. Peter stood a respectful distance back. "They are bound to you in ways most people cannot comprehend." She glanced over her shoulder. "Am I becoming my father, Lord Baelish? I feel the urge to burn my enemies. The desire is so strong." Peter met her gaze, his voice quiet but firm. "Your father let madness guide him. He ignored counsel, reveled in cruelty. Your grace, are different. You seek justice, not mindless destruction." She let out a small sigh. "But if my enemies will not yield, what else am I to do? My advisors counsel caution. Yet men, women, children suffer under the Lannisters' rule. The army of the dead marches closer every day. Perhaps I should simply roast Cersei on the throne and be done with it." Peter stepped closer, lowering his voice. "A swift victory might spark rebellion. Fear alone rarely builds loyalty. Conquer the CA. Pidle with too much fire, and the people will see only another tyrant. They will whisper that the Mad King's daughter has come to burn them all." She tensed, as if the truth of his words troubled her. Then she turned to face him fully. "I will not be like my father, and I will not let the realms suffer while I hesitate. Tyrion wants me to trap Cersei, to starve King's Landing so she surrenders. But the city will starve with her." Peter nodded. "It's a delicate balance, indeed." He studied her expression. He could sense the weight of her burdens. "Perhaps you can demonstrate your power in a targeted way, while also showing mercy. Strike at a key force of the Lannisters, force them to bend the knee, and let their soldiers live if they swear fealty. Make it clear that any man who surrenders will be spared, but those who do not will face the dragon's wrath." Daenerys tilted her head. "You suggest I choose a battlefield that will break Cersei's strength while sparing the common folk?" A slight smile touched Peter's lips. "Precisely. Let the realm see that the Mother of Dragons has a kind heart, but also let them see the unimaginable power you wield." Daenerys went silent, considering his words. In time, she would take Drogon to the battlefield where Jaime Lannister's forces marched from Highgarden, weighed down by wagons of gold. With a single draconic assault, she shattered the Lannister lines, roasted their wagons, and incinerated those who tried to stand against her. Yet she spared many, offering them the chance to bend the knee. Some refused and were executed, but many knelt. The realm trembled at the might of the Dragon Queen. Peter watched from the sidelines, seeing the flicker of fear and awe in the eyes of men who now saw Daenerys as a living manifestation of fire and blood. He whispered into the ears of Vale Knights, reinforcing the idea that they had chosen wisely to stand with her. He also sent messages to certain lords in the Riverlands, hinting that Daenerys' cause would prevail, and that it was best to switch sides before it was too late. Cersei, furious, ordered Qyburn to redouble his efforts to create scorpion ballistae that could wound dragons. But the field victory had rattled the queen in King's Landing. She knew the Targaryen was not to be trifled with, and that the armies of House Lannister were spread thin. Simultaneously, Jon Snow grew more desperate about the Night King's advance. He pleaded with Daenerys to join him in a mission to capture a White, to prove to all of Westeros that the undead threat was real. When Daenerys hesitated, Peter Baelish quietly advised caution. "Riding north of the wall with your dragons might be tempting, but it's also dangerous. I have heard stories of the cold from beyond the wall, stories that can chill the blood and hamper any advantage you have." Jon Snow, overhearing, bristled. "We have no choice. If we cannot convince the rest of Westeros to unite, all will be lost." Peter gave him a thin smile. "Then at least be certain that the realm you hope to save is truly yours to command. Bringing a White south may convince Cersei temporarily, but can she be trusted to honor a truce? Do you know how cunning she can be?" Jon's eyes narrowed. "I know well enough, but we must try. Lives are at stake." Daenerys, torn between her vow to break the wheel of tyranny and the recognition that the army of the dead threatened everyone, eventually agreed to allow Jon and a small party to venture north. Ser Jorah Mormont, the Hound, and a handful of others accompanied him. Peter stayed behind, for his strengths lay not on the battlefield but in the realm of secrets. He watched Daenerys pace anxiously in the courtyard of Dragonstone, day after day, scanning the horizon for any raven from the north. Word arrived that Jon's party was trapped beyond the wall, besieged by the endless tide of the undead. Daenerys took her dragons and soared north, determined to save them. Peter waited anxiously, his mind racing with the possibilities. If Daenerys perished, his carefully woven plans would crumble. If she triumphed, her legend would grow. A realm overrun by the undead would be of little use to him, so he found himself praying, for the first time in many years, that she would succeed. She returned, albeit grieving the loss of Viserion, slain and taken by the Night King. The news of an undead dragon chilled Peter's blood more than he cared to admit. Perhaps the threat to the living was greater than any Game of Thrones he had ever played. Still, he pressed on. He comforted Daenerys in his subtle way, whispering that she had done everything she could, that her cause was just, that the realm needed her even more now. In her grief, Daenerys leaned on him slightly, her guard lowered by sorrow. Peter did not overstep. He let her vulnerability meet only the softest of reassurances, enough to deepen her trust. Finally, with the evidence of a captured wight brought to Cersei's doorstep, a temporary truce was fashioned. Yet Peter Baelish trusted Cersei's sincerity no more than he trusted a pit of vipers. His correspondences with King's Landing's informants indicated that she planned to betray Daenerys and Jon Snow at the first opportunity, hoping the undead would thin their ranks before she reclaimed the realm. Peter relayed these suspicions to Daenerys through Tyrion, ensuring the message was delivered in a carefully couched manner that made him look like an invaluable source of intelligence. Thus, when Daenerys, Jon, and their combined forces marched north to Winterfell to prepare for the Great War against the Night King, Peter Baelish rode at her side. He had no desire to fight the dead, but he knew he must be present to seize the opportunities that would arise after the battle. The Vale Knights accompanied them, led by Lord Yohn Royce, but directed from behind the scenes by Peter. The journey was long and cold, the howling winds biting. The north had never felt so bleak, yet a grim determination suffused the armies who marched there. Upon arrival at Winterfell, Sansa Stark greeted Daenerys and Jon. Her eyes hardened as she saw Peter Baelish ride through the gates. She remembered what he had done to their aunt, to the lords of the Vale, and how he had once tried to turn her against her own sister. But the presence of Daenerys Targaryen on the back of a massive dragon overshadowed old resentments. The entire north braced for the final confrontation with the army of the dead. In the halls of Winterfell, Peter moved carefully, aware that Sansa's tolerance of him was thin. He sought out Arya, tried to glean her motivations, but her silence and piercing stare gave him little. He focused instead on rallying the Vale Knights, ensuring the fortress's supply lines, and offering counsel to Daenerys when asked. Though her entourage of advisors was larger than ever, she often found time to ask him about the Vale, the Southern Lords, or the intricacies of the realm's finances. He offered what knowledge he had, always with a hint of caution or suggestion that might lead her to see him as indispensable. Then the night came when the army of the dead descended upon Winterfell. The sky blotted out with swirling snow, and the white fields turned black with the moving tide of wights. Daenerys and Jon soared on dragons overhead, unleashing fire upon the undead. The living fought desperately, unsullied spears clashing with skeletal hands, Dothraki screamers unleashing furious battle cries that were soon snuffed out by the tide of darkness. The Vale Knights held a portion of the walls, valiantly defending the ramparts. Peter Baelish stayed away from the front lines, but he could not escape the carnage entirely. He felt the ice in the air, smelled the stench of death, heard the screams of men and women he had known only in passing. It was a battle unlike any Westeros had seen, a clash between life and the haunting specters of the long night. Amid the chaos, Peter's eyes occasionally darted across the courtyard, searching for a sign of victory or defeat. He saw Daenerys, dismounted after Drogon was temporarily overwhelmed by whites, fighting with a sword in her hand, her silver hair tangled and wild. Jorah Mormont stood beside her, defending her with fierce devotion. He saw Jon Snow battling the White Walkers near the Godswood, where Bran Stark waited as bait for the Night King. In the end, the living triumphed, but at great cost. Bodies were piled high. Winterfell's walls were cracked, its courtyards stained with blood and ice. Jorah Mormont lay dying in Daenerys' arms, his breath frosting in the cold night air. But the Night King was vanquished, undone by Arya Stark's blade. When the dust settled, the army of the dead was no more. Tears stained Daenerys' cheeks as she cradled Jorah, whispering a final goodbye to her loyal knight. Peter watched from a distance, feeling a pang of something that might have been empathy or regret. War always had a cost, and it was seldom the cunning who paid the highest price. He glanced at Sansa and Arya, who stood near each other, their expressions grim. The North had suffered dearly, but they had saved the realm. Their victory would echo through history. In the days that followed, the survivors mourned, burned the dead, and counted their losses. Queen Daenerys was hailed as a hero by many, for her dragons had rained fire upon the undead. Jon Snow was celebrated, too, though whispers of his Targaryen blood began to surface among the men. Sansa maintained her composure, focusing on the practicalities of rebuilding the North. Amid this turmoil, Peter Baelish found his moment to approach Daenerys once again. He found her in the library, late at night, poring over old records with Missandei. She looked up, exhaustion etched into her features. "My queen," he said softly, bowing his head. "We have won the war against the dead, but the war for the realm remains. Cersei Lannister will soon learn of the Night King's demise and will not remain idle. We must consider our next steps." Daenerys closed the tome, her gaze distant. "The next steps? Yes," she exhaled. "So many died here. I lost Viserion to the enemy, and now Rhaegal is injured, Drogon scarred. Jorah is gone. Yet another war looms." Peter spoke gently. "Yet your claim to the throne is stronger than ever. The realm owes you a debt for saving it. Now is the time to secure that loyalty. If you march south with the combined forces of the North, the Vale, and any remaining armies loyal to you, you can end the Lannister reign and establish a new order." She studied him, perhaps looking for any sign of deceit. "You would counsel me to march on King's Landing now, when our men are exhausted and wounded?" "Not immediately," Peter replied, "but soon. Cersei will not wait for you to recover fully. She will strike as soon as she believes you vulnerable. You still have 2 dragons, and your combined forces, though depleted, are victorious heroes in the eyes of many. The realm is yours for the taking, and you can offer the people the peace they have longed for." Her eyes flickered with resolve. "I will do what must be done, but I will not become a butcher. I will give Cersei the chance to surrender." "Mercy suits you, my queen." Peter bowed again. "May I suggest, before you march, you issue a call for parley? Make a formal request for Cersei's surrender. If she refuses, you will have done your duty to avoid bloodshed." She considered it, nodding slowly. "Yes, that seems right." Rising from the table, she dismissed Peter with a weary smile of gratitude. He walked away, that subtle glint of triumph in his eyes. The game was not over, far from it. He had allied with Daenerys Targaryen, guided her steps in subtle ways, and become part of her inner circle. His influence, though still shadowed by the presence of Tyrion, Missandei, and the Starks, was growing. The final confrontation with Cersei would be the ultimate test of whether Daenerys could maintain her moral compass or be driven by the thirst for vengeance. Peter suspected that the fires of war might tempt her down a darker path. Yet in that darkness, he could shine as an advisor who offered measured counsel, perhaps pulling the strings of the realm once more. And if Daenerys did ascend the Iron Throne, with thousands of grateful subjects chanting her name, Peter Baelish would be there, standing at her right hand, offering quiet words of guidance. The illusions he had spun, the alliances he had forged, and the debts he had collected would ensure he was woven into the very fabric of her reign. Perhaps this time he would not merely be a background player. Perhaps he would be the one truly holding the realm's future in his grasp, concealed behind the gentle flutter of the Targaryen banners and the roar of dragons, always a whisper away from the ear of the queen. Only time would reveal whether his loyalty was genuine or if he saw Daenerys as just another piece on the chessboard. For now, he relished the knowledge that he had placed himself at the center of power once again, this time aligned with the might of dragons. And in a realm still trembling from the echoes of winter's horrors, that might be all he needed to finally see his grand design come to fruition. But even in the aftermath of this triumph against the undead, the alliances within Winterfell were precarious. Northerners who had once bent the knee to Jon Snow as king in the north now saw Daenerys Targaryen standing at his side, calling herself their queen. The scars left by centuries of Targaryen rule could not be erased in a single night, even if she had saved them from an icy oblivion. Many whispered in the corridors that they would rather bow to a Stark, not a dragonlord from across the sea. Peter Baelish sensed the tension like a bloodhound catching a distant scent. He offered quiet reassurances to those knights and lords who felt conflicted, reminding them that a Targaryen alone had the power to break the wheel of oppression once and for all. He told them how Cersei Lannister would sooner see the North burn than kneel to any power beyond her own. The war against the dead was over, but the war for the very soul of Westeros remained. If they betrayed Daenerys now, he warned, they would squander the unity forged in the fires of that terrible battle. Daenerys, for her part, did not ignore the cold stares. She addressed the great hall of Winterfell, standing where the kings of winter once held court. Her voice carried through the old stone walls, resolute and unyielding. "I have come to free the realm from tyrants," she declared. "I did not cross the sea to enslave you or your children. I came because your king, Jon Snow, has convinced me that together we can build a better future. You have my word. I will not forsake the North, nor demand you forget your traditions. But I do ask for your loyalty, as I offer you mine in return." Some among the northern lords inclined their heads, swayed by her sincerity. Others looked to Sansa Stark for guidance, trusting the Lady of Winterfell above all. Sansa remained neutral but polite, her inner reservations hidden behind a mask of courteous acceptance. Peter watched her keenly, reading the flicker of doubt in her eyes. He had once tried to sow discord between her and Arya, hoping to exploit their rivalry, only for them to unite against him. Now, with Daenerys in the picture, Sansa's caution extended to the new queen as well. Winter's chill still lingered outside, though the worst of the threat had passed with the defeat of the Night King. The battered remains of Daenerys' forces, unsullied, Dothraki, the Vale Knights, and the surviving northern men, needed time to rest and heal. Daenerys consulted with Jon, Tyrion, and Peter about the best approach to retaking the south. The plan coalesced around sending envoys to key regions, the Stormlands, the Reach, and Dorne, seeking to revive alliances that had once favored House Targaryen. Cersei's advantage now lay in the capital, with a battered yet still formidable army and the potential for new partnerships. Above all, she was rumored to be hiring the Golden Company, mercenaries from Essos, using the gold taken from Highgarden before Daenerys' ambush had destroyed most of the wagons. Peter slipped into these discussions with practiced ease. He pointed out which lords in the Reach might be swayed by promises of restored traditions and peace. He advised caution in dealing with Dorne, a proud region that might be eager to see the fall of House Lannister after the death of their ruling family, yet suspicious of any outsider's claims to authority. Daenerys listened, though she never let him dominate the conversation. Tyrion stood as a bulwark, challenging Peter's suggestions if they smelled of subterfuge. Yet the queen found herself in need of Peter's connections. Lord Robin Arryn's official seat remained in the Eyrie, but Peter's hold over the Vale's affairs was such that its knights moved at his word. Now, in the lull after the Undead War, Peter proposed a grand rallying of Vale forces to march south as part of Daenerys' host. He assured her that while the Vale might not field the largest army in Westeros, it was among the most disciplined, well-equipped, and loyal, provided the queen honored its contributions when she assumed the Iron Throne. Grant the Vale certain trade rights, he murmured one evening as the fires crackled in the hearth. Promise them a seat on your small council. That will secure their devotion. Daenerys, seated across from him, nodded with careful deliberation. Such an arrangement can be made, but I do not wish to show favoritism to one region at the expense of others. Peter tilted his head, a small, almost paternal smile touching his lips. Naturally, Your Grace, but the Vale has been overlooked for generations, overshadowed by more prominent regions. A queen who recognizes their worth would earn their undying loyalty. She eyed him. You speak from personal experience, I gather. You were born in the Vale, were you not? Peter allowed a brief look of wistfulness to cross his face, though every nuance was carefully controlled. I was raised there, yes. I owe much of who I am to that rocky corner of the realm. I have simply tried to ensure it receives its due. The conversation drifted to other matters, logistics of supply lines, the arrangement of ships, and the possibility of launching a two-pronged assault by both land and sea. The warmth of the fire contrasted sharply with the icy stone walls of Winterfell, and Daenerys rubbed her arms as if trying to ward off a deeper chill. Peter, for his part, made no move to close the physical distance between them. He had learned long ago that pressuring a queen, especially this queen, would yield no gain. Rather, he offered only quiet counsel, letting her come to rely on his insights. Outside, the snowfall lessened by the day. Birds began their cautious songs, sensing the slow retreat of winter. Workers repaired the battered gates, the scorched towers, and the shattered battlements. The courtyard rang with the clang of forging metal as Gendry, King Robert's bastard turned blacksmith, labored to replenish the supply of weapons. The region had to be ready for another war, this time against a living foe. Daenerys walked those courtyards daily, greeting the men and women who toiled there, reminding them that their sacrifice had not been in vain. Peter continued to send messages to King's Landing, using channels he had established long before the War of the Five Kings even began. Some of these ravens found their way to Qyburn's ears, but Peter was careful never to fully reveal his position. Instead, he fed the capital half-truths, implying that Daenerys' fork ES were weaker than they really were, or that internal strife plagued the north. In reality, he was doing everything possible to shore up the new queen's hold on the realm, while leading Cersei astray. Each time he penned one of those letters, he felt a tremor of satisfaction. The puppet strings were in his hands now, and the players scarcely knew they danced to his tune. Finally, the day arrived when the snows receded enough to permit a mass exodus from Winterfell. Daenerys, riding Drogon, led the vanguard. Rhaegal circled overhead, wounded from the great battle but still capable of flight. The combined armies stretched across the horizon. Unsullied in disciplined ranks, Dothraki mounted and restless, Northmen marching under direwolf banners, Vale Knights bearing the sigil of the Moon and Falcon, and a smattering of other forces that had survived the long night. The men carried with them the solemn pride of having defeated an inhuman foe, yet also the weariness that comes from witnessing countless friends and kin die in the process. Peter rode near the front, close to Daenerys' retinue, ensuring that rumors of his standing would ripple through the ranks. He caught glimpses of Sansa and Arya watching from the walls of Winterfell as the army marched out, their expressions unreadable. Bran Stark, in his strange, distant manner, offered no parting words. Peter could only wonder what the new three-eyed raven foresaw for the realm. He prayed that whatever it was, it did not hamper his plans. The Queen's host headed south, forging alliances along the way. In the Riverlands, many Tully bannermen, fueled by hatred for the Lannisters after the Red Wedding, pledged their support. Lord Edmure Tully, freed from imprisonment, welcomed Daenerys' forces but seemed cautious, unsure of what game Peter Baelish might be playing. Still, the banners of the Trout soon joined the march. Further along, the lordless lands near Harrenhal, once Peter's own seat, yielded mixed welcomes. Many had been broken by wars, left impoverished by raiding armies. Daenerys, heeding Peter's counsel, offered them aid and protection in exchange for loyalty. As the columns of warriors advanced, Daenerys' scouts sent word that Cersei had indeed recruited the Golden Company. They had landed near King's Landing, bolstering the city's defenses. The Iron Fleet under Euron Greyjoy patrolled the Blackwater Bay, poised to hurl fire at any incoming ships. Tyrion suggested a siege, but Daenerys, recalling her father's madness and her own moral code, worried that laying siege to King's Landing would result in thousands of civilian deaths. She did not want to become a queen of ashes. The sun was setting when they made camp in the Reach, near the Blackwater Rush. Soldiers erected tents, lit torches, and prepared for a council of war in Daenerys' pavilion. Peter joined Tyrion, Missandei, Grey Worm, Ser Davos, Jon Snow, and a subdued Varys. Daenerys laid out the letters from her scouts, tension visible on her face. Cersei refuses to surrender, Daenerys said. The Golden Company has fortified the walls. Euron Greyjoy roams the sea. If we attack head-on, we risk a bloodbath. If we siege the city, thousands may starve. Tyrion frowned. If only there was a way to force a conflict outside the city walls, where your dragons can make the difference without harming civilians. Jon Snow folded his arms. Could we blockade the city from the sea, cut off supplies, and force a surrender without storming the walls? Varys shook his head. Euron's fleet would contest any blockade. We might lose too many ships. All eyes turned to Peter, who stood calmly, hands behind his back. He let a beat pass, then spoke. There might be another way, a smaller infiltration. Someone who can enter the city, sow discord, and open the gates from within. Tyrion frowned. That's a dangerous gamble. Who would risk such a mission? Peter's gaze swept over the group. I have connections in the capital, people who remember me and owe me favors. If we can coordinate a secret operation to sabotage the city's defenses, disable the Scorpion Ballistae, compromise the Golden Company's discipline, Cersei might be forced to rally her forces outside the walls, where your dragons can meet them on open ground. Jon Snow's wariness deepened. And if this fails, we lose the element of surprise. Daenerys' eyes narrowed. Who would lead this infiltration? Peter dipped his head with mock humility. With your blessing, I can go myself, accompanied by a small team. I know the hidden ways into the Red Keep. If we succeed, the gates will open, and your armies can take the city with minimal bloodshed. Jon Snow shook his head. You'd be walking into the lion's den. Cersei is no fool. Tyrion studied Peter carefully. True, but if there is anyone who could slip through the cracks, it's Peter Baelish. He once outwitted nearly every great house at one time or another. Daenerys regarded Peter, suspicion and necessity warring in her expression. If you betray us, Lord Baelish, I will feed you to my dragons. Peter inclined his head. Understood, your grace. My life is forfeit if I stray. But if I succeed, Cersei's tyranny ends, and your reign begins. After long debate, they refined the plan. Peter would take a small cadre of skilled infiltrators, volunteers from the Unsullied and a few Northern Rangers, enter King's Landing in disguise, then sabotage key defenses. At the right moment, Daenerys' forces would seize the advantage. Tyrion gave insights on the city's maze of streets, the storage of wildfire, and the likely disposition of the Golden Company. 3 nights later, Peter stood on a hillside overlooking the distant glow of King's Landing, the city he once ruled from the shadows. He wore plain garments, having set aside the finery of his earlier station. A dozen infiltrators waited at his signal, hearts pounding with the knowledge that the fate of the realm hinged on their success. Remember, Peter said softly, we move as one. If anything goes amiss, regroup at the old fishmonger's warehouse near the river gate. Trust no one. With that, they descended, slipping into the city at dawn amid a crowd of fishermen. The guards at the gate barely glanced at them, bored with the routine of checking incoming peasants. Once inside, King's Landing's stench enveloped them. Human waste, rotting refuse, brine from the bay. Peter ignored his own wave of nostalgia, focusing on the mission. He dispatched small teams of Unsullied to sabotage Scorpions, Northern Rangers to eliminate isolated Golden Company patrols. Then he made for the Red Keep's secret passages. In a dusty alcove behind a crumbling statue, he found the hidden latch to a spiral staircase. Guided by an oil lamp, he descended into darkness. The air was stale with old secrets, the walls whispering the echoes of lovers, murderers, and schemers who had passed this way before. At last, he emerged near the royal stables, close to the gate that led to the inner wards. Golden Company soldiers stood guard. Peter pressed himself into the shadows, waiting for the city beyond the keep to erupt in chaos. A faint orange glow lit the sky. Shouts and alarm bells rang out. The sabotage had begun. Golden Company soldiers scrambled to respond, ballistae failing or bursting into flame. At the crucial moment, Peter rushed forward, dispatching 2 guards at the gate. A knife in the dark for one, a parried sword thrust for the other. His arm throbbed from a shallow gash, but adrenaline fueled him. He seized a ring of keys from a dying guard's belt, forcing it into the winch mechanism. With a strained groan, the gates began to rise. An alarm was raised from within the keep. Crossbowmen rushed into the courtyard. Peter kept cranking, ignoring the burn in his muscles. Then Drogon's roar tore the sky asunder, flames consuming the battlements to the east. Screams echoed. The crossbowmen scattered. Peter finished opening the gate as Unsullied surged forward, led by Grey Worm. Northmen and Vale Knights followed, the courtyard erupting in steel and blood. A flicker of triumph crossed Peter's mind. He had done it. Daenerys' forces now had a direct path into the Red Keep. If all went well, the city would fall swiftly, sparing countless innocents. Suddenly, a crossbow bolt hissed through the air, aimed at Grey Worm's exposed flank. Peter moved instinctively, shouting a warning. The bolt sank into Peter's side, just above the hip, spinning him into the iron bars. He collapsed, tasting blood on his tongue. His vision blurred, but he saw Grey Worm dispatch the crossbowmen, then Daenerys' host pouring through the gate. Golden Company soldiers faltered. The keep's final defenses crumbled as Daenerys soared overhead, dismounting from Drogon in the courtyard. She strode past the carnage, missing Peter at first, but then she halted. Her gaze found him slumped against the gate, blood pooling beneath him. "Lord Baelish," she murmured, kneeling beside him, pressing her hand to his wound. "I'll get a maester. Stay still." Peter coughed, forcing a weak laugh. "I've opened the way. The throne is yours." She looked startled, perhaps uncertain why he had risked himself for Grey Worm. "You could have let him die," she whispered. "Yet you chose to save him." Peter tried to speak, but only a rattling gasp escaped his lips. "Grey Worm is vital. Needed for your victory." Daenerys' hand, sticky with his blood, pressed harder. "Don't talk. Save your strength." But Peter felt the cold creeping in, his heartbeat growing faint. Dimly, he heard the clang of steel, the roars of dragons, and the war cries of an army claiming the heart of Westeros. He had spent a lifetime spinning webs of deceit and betrayal. In the end, he had used his final gambit to help Daenerys triumph, believing that her rise would reshape the realm in ways a petty king or queen never could. A strange contentment settled over him. For once, he had played a part in something grander than himself, and it felt almost redeeming. Darkness crowded his vision as he clung to the queen's gaze. His lips formed a final whisper, "Break the wheel." Whether he lived or died, Peter Baelish had ensured his place in the story of Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons, who now stood at the threshold of the Iron Throne. As the battle raged around them, the last of his consciousness flickered like a dying candle. Perhaps, in another life, he would have reveled in holding power beside her. But in this life, he had done what he did best. He played the game, took his risks, and shaped the fate of Westeros with a cunning hand until the very end. Daenerys Targaryen knelt beside Peter Baelish in the blood-slick courtyard of the Red Keep. Her hand pressed firmly to the crossbow wound in his side. The reek of smoke and charred flesh hung in the air, mingling with the tang of his blood. Grey Worm and the Unsullied pressed onward into the keep, determined to rout the last of the Golden Company and any remaining Lannister loyalists. All around, the clash of steel and the cries of the wounded and dying created a cacophony that set Daenerys's nerves aflame. Every breath she took felt like it rasped over hot coals. She was close, so close, to the Iron Throne she had sought for so long. Yet here she was on her knees, trying to save the life of a man she had never fully trusted. He blinked up at her, struggling to remain conscious. His lips parted, but no words emerged. A fresh pulse of blood soaked through the rags she held against him. She wanted to call out for a maester, but the city was in chaos, and there was no telling who was still alive or where the healers might be. Drogon roared overhead, sweeping low past the towers, the force of his wing beats rattling stones and extinguishing torches. For a moment, the swirling smoke cleared, revealing a glimpse of the Red Keep's topmost battlements. Daenerys's eyes flicked upward, then back to Peter. She wondered, fleetingly, how long she could remain here before everything slipped out of her grasp. "Hold on," she whispered, pressing her weight against him, desperate to stem the flow of blood. He winced, forcing a tremulous half-smile. His pale features glistened with sweat. She remembered how he had opened the gates for her, how a single bold act from the realm's most notorious schemer had saved Grey Worm's life and cleared the way for her forces. She could not quite reconcile that Peter Baelish, the man who had thrived on chaos, had performed an act so close to heroic. She found herself unexpectedly unwilling to watch him die. Just then, two Unsullied appeared on the far side of the courtyard, panting, spears clutched tight. She waved them over with her free hand. One soldier knelt, his eyes flicking to Peter's wound, then back to Daenerys in silent question. She nodded, struggling to maintain composure. "Take him," she said. "Find a maester if you can, or anyone who knows how to tend wounds. He may not have long." The pair hoisted Peter Baelish as gently as they could. He grimaced but did not cry out, his breath little more than a ragged hiss. Daenerys rose, ignoring the aching protest of her muscles and the sharp stabs of grief for all she had lost. She watched as the Unsullied bore Peter through the broken archway leading deeper into the keep. That might be the last time she ever saw him alive, she realized. Yet there was no time for regrets or lingering sentiments. The thunderous footfalls of fresh soldiers echoed in the corridor beyond. One of her Dothraki blood riders came charging in, his curved arak streaked with gore, shouting in halting common tongue that the throne room was within reach if she pushed now. Daenerys steeled herself. The city might yet surrender if she claimed Cersei swiftly, or Cersei might burn it all before she relinquished power. She could not guess which outcome awaited, but hesitation would only make matters worse. Summoning Drogon with a sharp whistle, she vaulted onto a battered dais in the courtyard to get a clearer view. The courtyard gates, which Peter had flung open, still hung ajar, twisted by the battle's fury. Dead or dying Golden Company soldiers lay in heaps, trampled by Unsullied boots. Within the keep itself, the last barricades had been shattered. Smoke trailed from arrow-scorched tapestries and the remnants of small fires in the corridors. She spotted Tyrion near a group of Unsullied at the far end of the courtyard. He was gesturing frantically, trying to direct them in subduing a knot of Lannister crossbowmen. Grey Worm impaled the last of them with a brutal thrust, clearing a path. Daenerys strode forward. She had no illusions that Cersei would greet her with any pretense of courtesy. If the Lannister queen was alive, she would be barricaded in the highest tower or perhaps cowering in Maegor's Holdfast. Daenerys motioned for Tyrion to join her. He came at once, limping slightly on a twisted ankle, his face set in grim determination. Before she could speak, he answered her unspoken question, voice tight with dread. Cersei was last seen retreating toward the throne room. Jaime might be with her or might not. No one seems to know. He brushed sweat-soaked hair back from his brow. If she is cornered, there's no telling what she will do. We both know how Qyburn has stalked the Red Keep with wildfire in the past. Daenerys nodded, her mouth set in a hard line. The memory of her father's obsession with wildfire haunted her still. She could not let the city go up in green flames. Have the men search every storeroom. If they find caches of wildfire, they should secure them immediately. We can't let her ignite the city out of spite. Tyrion signaled to a cluster of Unsullied standing nearby, repeating her orders. Daenerys' heart pounded as she began climbing the grand steps leading to the upper corridors. Behind her, loyal soldiers followed, stepping over rubble and bodies. The stench of death intensified. Flickers of torchlight revealed anxious faces among those who had once served the crown. A handful of red keepstaff cowered in alcoves, covering their heads. Some parted with urgent pleas for mercy or calls for help. She swept past them, offering none. She could not slow now. Soon, they reached a pair of high, ornate doors. One had been blasted off its hinges. The other hung crooked, battered by what looked like a makeshift battering ram. Beyond, Daenerys knew, lay the throne room. She took a breath, holding it for a heartbeat, and then stepped through. Smoke clung to the vaulted ceiling. Shafts of light from shattered windows illuminated drifts of dust and rubble. Once, the grandeur of this hall had been legendary, the seat of royal power in Westeros. Now, torn tapestries and scorched pillars bore witness to the fury that had swept through. A handful of Lannister soldiers lay strewn across the floor, cut down by unsullied spears. But no sign of Cersei. Daenerys advanced, stepping carefully. Her gaze flicked to the far end of the hall, where the Iron Throne loomed on its dais. She hesitated, feeling a strange mixture of anticipation and sorrow. For so long, she had dreamed of this moment, crossing the sea to reclaim the seat her ancestors had forged. And yet the journey had cost her so much: dragons, friends, her own innocence about the nature of power. The clang of weapons jolted her from her thoughts. Ser Davos and a group of Northmen burst into the hall from a side passage, panting, eyes darting. "No sign of Cersei," Davos said, exasperation etched into the lines of his face. "We've combed 2 levels of the keep, but she's vanished." One guard claims she fled toward Maegor's Holdfast. Tyrion grimaced. Then she might try to escape through the tunnels beneath it, or hold herself up in the Queen's chambers until she can no longer deny reality. If Jaime found her, they could be hiding somewhere else entirely. Daenerys forced her attention away from the throne, turning instead to the massive doors that led deeper into the Red Keep. "Take me there," she commanded, voice echoing in the ruinous hall. "I won't have her slip away. She must answer for everything she's done." Davos nodded. The men fell in line behind her once more, forging through corridors where shattered suits of armor lay like broken sentinels. Daenerys heard shrieks and sobs from distant rooms, but she pressed on. They reached the passage that led to Maegor's Holdfast, an enclosed fortress within a fortress where Targaryen kings had once found sanctuary, and sometimes madness. The gate there was locked. 2 remaining guards, wearing the lion's sigil on their armor, leveled pikes. Their faces showed the despair of men who knew they were outnumbered. Daenerys lifted a hand to stay her soldiers. With careful steps, she advanced. The guards exchanged a glance, clearly torn between duty and survival. One of them spoke, voice trembling. "The Queen is inside. She said she'd have our heads if we deserted. But if we let you pass, she'll kill our families." Daenerys' face hardened. She thought of how many families had been torn apart by Cersei's cruelty. "Surrender," she said, trying to keep her tone even, "and your families will be spared. I am not here to slaughter the innocent. Lay down your weapons, and I swear to you your lives will be spared." The soldiers exchanged another look. Then, in a moment of shared decision, they let their pikes fall to the floor with a clang. Daenerys exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. One of the Unsullied rushed forward with a heavy mallet, smashing the lock on the gate. The iron fell away, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into the Holdfast's labyrinth. Daenerys was certain now that she would find Cersei somewhere below. She descended, flanked by Tyrion and Davos. Behind them marched a handful of Unsullied and Northmen, torches held high. The air turned cold and damp, the walls slick with ancient moss. Echoes of water dripped from unseen corners. The corridors split in multiple directions, each lit by sparse lanterns. They tried one route, but it ended in a locked storeroom. Another led to a crypt lined with dusty sarcophagi. At last, they found a passage that smelled of fresh air and salt, likely running beneath the keep toward the sea. That was where they spotted a flicker of lantern light ahead. Daenerys raised a hand to halt her companions. Quietly, she crept forward, footsteps muffled by the damp stone. Peering around a corner, she glimpsed a small cove where the passage opened up. Several large crates lined the walls, food, supplies, possibly relics for an escape by boat. And there, dressed in a once elegant gown now torn and stained, stood Cersei Lannister. Her golden hair lay disheveled around her shoulders, and her eyes burned with a kind of desperate defiance. She clutched a dagger in one trembling hand. Tyrion let out a soft gasp at the sight of her. Daenerys steeled her resolve. She stepped into the cove, revealing herself. Cersei startled, whirling to face her. Behind Cersei stood Qyburn, face drawn, his hands wrapped protectively around several vials of pale green liquid, wildfire. Near them, a battered Jaime Lannister leaned against a half-collapsed pillar, clutching the stump of his missing hand, his face carved with pain. The tension in the air was so thick Daenerys could almost taste it. Cersei hissed, eyes wild. "You dare to chase me down here, you foreign usurper?" She raised the dagger, but her hand shook. Her once regal bearing had crumbled like the rest of King's Landing. "You've lost," Daenerys said, voice echoing against the dripping walls. "The city is ours. The Red Keep is fallen. Surrender, and perhaps the realm might still know some measure of mercy for you." Cersei let out a short, humorless laugh. "Mercy? From the daughter of the Mad King? I've seen what your dragons can do. I've seen what your armies can do. Don't lecture me on mercy." Daenerys's jaw tightened, but she did not move. Tyrion stepped forward, trying to put himself between Daenerys and Cersei. "Sister," he began softly, "end this. Don't let more people die needlessly. The city is lost. The Golden Company was routed. Euron's fleet is in shambles. We both know you've made enemies beyond counting. Let it be done. Don't force Daenerys's hand." Cersei's face twisted. She glanced at Jaime, whose gaze flicked between his twin and Daenerys. He looked torn, haunted by everything that had come to pass. "I never wanted it to end like this," he said hoarsely, pressing a blood-soaked cloth to a wound on his side. "Cersei, please." She glared at Jaime, eyes brimming with anger and betrayal. "We were supposed to rule together. We were supposed to destroy anyone who threatened our family. And now look at you." Her voice cracked, and for a heartbeat, Daenerys saw not a vicious queen but a desperate woman, terrified of losing everything she had ever clung to. Qyburn, still clutching his vials of wildfire, spoke up then, voice oily and tremulous. "Your Grace, we must not yield. There are ways to turn the tide." He cast a furtive glance at the crates, then at the flickering torches that lined the walls. Daenerys understood immediately. He was contemplating igniting the wildfire, perhaps burying them all in a cataclysmic inferno. Her heart thudded. Tyrion seemed to realize it too, for he lunged forward with a cry, as if to grab the vials from Qyburn's grasp. The sudden movement broke the fragile standstill. Jaime lunged between them, trying to shield Tyrion from any potential blow from Cersei. Daenerys snapped an order, and two Unsullied rushed in, spears raised. Cersei shrieked, slashing wildly with her dagger, but her strength was spent. One of the Unsullied expertly disarmed her, twisting her wrist until the blade clattered to the floor. Qyburn, snarling, tried to fling a vial of wildfire at them, but Grey Worm stepped in from behind, driving a spear through Qyburn's chest. The man gasped, eyes widening in shock. His hand opened, releasing the vial. It shattered harmlessly on the wet floor, hissing faintly but failing to ignite. In the ensuing scuffle, Jaime sank to his knees, pressing a hand to his bandaged side, face contorted with agony. Cersei's knees buckled as well, the last of her bravado draining away. She looked around in a daze, as though struggling to recognize the world. Her city was gone, her soldiers were dead or scattered, and her last confidant had been run through by a spear. Tyrion cautiously took a step toward her, but she recoiled, hatred smoldering in her tear-rimmed eyes. Daenerys approached, forcing herself to remain calm. The weight of every innocent life lost in the war pressed down on her shoulders. She was exhausted, physically, emotionally, spiritually. "Cersei Lannister," she said, voice echoing in the cold chamber. "You stand accused of countless crimes. The murder of my allies, the slaughter of innocents, the betrayal of truces, the hoarding of wildfire to burn your own city. The realm cries for justice." Cersei coughed, blood flecking her lips. "Justice?" she mocked, though her voice trembled. "Who are you to judge me? You burned men alive in the Reach. You unleashed Dothraki on the shores of Westeros. You—" Daenerys cut her off with a sharp gesture. "I have done what I must to free the realm from tyrants like you. My father's sins do not absolve you of your own. Your time is over." Silence settled then, broken only by Jaime's pained breathing and the distant roar of battle. Daenerys considered Cersei with an almost clinical detachment. She had imagined this moment differently. Perhaps a trial, where the people would see the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms answer for her crimes. But now, as she stood in the gloom beneath the Red Keep, the question of how exactly to handle Cersei weighed heavily on her. She felt Tyrion's gaze on her, felt the tension in every unsullied soldier present. Would she choose an execution here and now? Or would she drag Cersei back upstairs, to be paraded and judged? Before she could decide, Jaime stirred, reaching out with his remaining hand to touch Cersei's shoulder. "It's done," he whispered to her. "Let it end." Cersei stared at him, eyes brimming with tears. Then her defiance gave way, and she sagged forward, sobbing. Tyrion, torn between fury and pity, approached again, but she did not lash out. The dagger lay far behind her, and her spirit seemed broken. Daenerys lifted her chin, fixing Cersei with a final, appraising look. "Secure her," she commanded, voice steady. "We will decide her fate in daylight, where all can witness." Grey Worm and another Unsullied stepped forward, binding Cersei's hands. She neither struggled nor spoke. Jaime tried to rise, but his strength failed, and he stumbled. Ser Davos rushed in to catch him before he collapsed. Tyrion's face was ashen. Together, they made their way back through the dripping passageways, emerging into the smoky corridors of the Red Keep. Soldiers parted to let their queen pass, their eyes drawn to Cersei's bound form and the wounded Jaime. A hush fell over the keep, a palpable sense that the war was all but won. As they climbed the last flight of stairs, Daenerys found herself glancing at Tyrion, who walked beside her. His expression was unreadable, torn between relief and sorrow. She wondered if he could truly accept the sight of his siblings brought so low, or if part of him would resent her for how this ended. He caught her gaze, managing a faint nod of acknowledgement. She returned it in kind, grateful for his presence, even if their alliance had been tested time and again. Outside, dawn had begun to gray the sky. The fires in King's Landing still smoldered, but many had been extinguished by the combined efforts of freedmen and soldiers. The city smelled of ashes and despair. They led Cersei through the courtyards, past lines of Unsullied standing at attention. Some Lannister men, still clinging to their battered armor, gaped at the sight of their former queen, bound and trembling. Daenerys could sense the wave of shock ripple through them. Perhaps some would try to fight on, but most looked ready to throw down their arms. In the midst of the courtyard, they found a small group of maesters who had been pressed into tending the wounded. Peter Baelish was among those laid out on makeshift pallets. His face looked gray, eyes closed, breath shallow. A bloodied bandage wrapped his torso. One maester hovered over him, shaking his head as if the prognosis was grim. Daenerys paused, something twisting in her chest. She had no time to linger, but she turned to one of the Unsullied, giving a curt order to provide the maesters with whatever supplies they needed for Peter's care, or anyone else's. She could not say why she felt compelled to save him. Maybe because it was his final act of loyalty that had opened King's Landing to her, or because she saw in him a piece of Westeros's cunning that might yet be put to use. Or perhaps, after so much death, she simply wanted to save anyone who could still be saved. She tore her gaze from Peter's still form and continued on, leading the procession deeper into the heart of the Red Keep, where a large audience chamber remained partially intact. Its pillars were scorched but still standing, and sections of the roof were blackened with soot but not collapsed. There, Daenerys commanded her Unsullied to stand guard while she decided the immediate fate of Cersei and Jaime. She considered making a show of it, calling forth the remaining lords and knights who had once served the Iron Throne, but exhaustion bore down on her like a physical weight. The realm might demand a trial, but the realm was not standing here, ankle-deep in ruin, at the brink of collapse. Cersei looked up, eyes red from tears and smoke, her cheeks streaked with grime. Jaime leaned against a cracked pillar, pressing his bandaged side, his breath coming in short, painful rasps. Tyrion stood to Daenerys' right, and Grey Worm to her left, each waiting for her word. At length, she spoke, her voice carrying the authority she had claimed since first calling herself Khaleesi among the Dothraki. Cersei Lannister, for your crimes against the people of Westeros, for the murder of allies, for the betrayal of truces, and for the countless innocents who have suffered under your rule, I hereby place you under arrest. You will answer for these crimes before a council of the realm, and if found guilty, face the Queen's justice. Cersei's lips curled bitterly, but she did not speak. Perhaps she knew the futility. Perhaps she was past caring. Jaime tried to speak in her defense, but a wet cough racked his body, cutting him off. Daenerys gave a slight nod to the Unsullied, who pulled Cersei roughly away, binding her wrists behind her back with heavier manacles. Jaime, trembling, looked at Tyrion. There was a plea in his eyes, some last hope that his brother could spare him or Cersei from a harsher sentence. Tyrion swallowed hard. Your Grace, he said quietly, spare Jaime from the same condemnation. He fought for you at Winterfell. He rode north when others would have stayed behind. Let him live, if only for the debt the North owes him. Daenerys weighed this. Jaime had come north, had wielded a sword against the dead. He had also once been called Kingslayer, the man who had ended her father's reign of madness. A swirl of emotions rose in her, some contradictory. At last she spoke. Jaime Lannister, you did break your vows and stab a king in the back, but it was the Mad King who threatened to burn this city. You fought against the army of the dead, and for that I cannot condemn you outright. You will remain under guard for now until your injuries heal. Your fate will be decided alongside your sisters, but your service in Winterfell will be weighed in your favor. Jaime bowed his head, clutching his wound. Thank you, he whispered, his voice raw with grief. His gaze flicked to Cersei, who stood rigid, a guard at each elbow. She offered no response, only a hollow glare at the floor. Daenerys signaled for the Unsullied to remove them both. Cersei allowed herself to be taken, but her eyes flitted up to Daenerys' face with a fury that had not yet died. Perhaps she would never truly bend to the new queen. Perhaps that hatred would smolder until her last breath. Daenerys watched her go, uncertain what the future might bring. One thing was clear. The lion had been dethroned, and the dragon had claimed her place. In the ensuing hours, as the sun rose over a city shattered by war, Daenerys worked tirelessly to restore some semblance of order. Tyrion and Davos led search parties through the Red Keep, rooting out any pockets of Lannister loyalists too stubborn to surrender. Grey Worm organized patrols through the streets, ensuring that chaos did not reign among the common folk. The Dothraki roamed restlessly, occasionally needing to be reined in to prevent them from pillaging what was left of the city. A wave of refugees, once trapped within the walls, emerged from hidden cellars and alleys. They seemed stunned to find a new queen in command, uncertain whether to be relieved or terrified. Slowly, the fires died down, and the smoke cleared, revealing the stark damage. Entire sections of King's Landing lay in rubble. Charred timbers jutted from collapsed roofs. Broken cobblestones crunched underfoot. The living scurried to find water, food, or lost loved ones. Daenerys refused to remain cloistered. She walked among the people, flanked by unsullied guards, her armor streaked with soot and grime. She encountered men and women with hollow eyes, children separated from parents, and old folk who had lost everything but still clung to life. It wrenched at her heart, reminding her of the suffering she had witnessed in Essos. This, too, was the cost of war, and it fell hardest on the powerless. Near the dragon pit, she found Jon Snow. He was helping triage wounded soldiers alongside a few maesters and healers. His face was haggard, hair plastered to his brow, dark circles under his eyes. When he saw her, he paused, stepping away from the man he'd been bandaging. Their gazes locked. So much had changed since the day they first met in Dragonstone. He was no longer the king in the north, and she was no longer just the claimant to the throne. Now, she was the victor, albeit a Pyrrhic one, and he was something more than a mere ally. Something with Targaryen blood in his veins. Daenerys felt the weight of that knowledge burning between them. Jon cleared his throat, voice hoarse. "I heard you captured Cersei. Is it over?" Then, she nodded, lips pressed tight. "She's under guard. Jaime, too. The fighting here is all but done. Pockets of resistance might remain, but they're leaderless." Jon exhaled, relief mingled with sorrow. "We lost good men today. The city is in ruins. At least the slaughter is done." Daenerys stepped closer, lowering her voice so the surrounding soldiers wouldn't hear. "Jon, help me keep order. The people trust you more than they trust me. They remember your stand against the Night King. They'll need your reassurance that we're here to protect them, not oppress them." He nodded slowly, understanding the delicate nature of the task. I'll do what I can. But the North is still wary. They fear a Targaryen queen might bring them the same fate that befell King's Landing today." She felt a stab of guilt. Though she had tried to minimize civilian casualties, war never spared the innocent. She placed a hand on Jon's arm. "Tell them the truth, that I have no wish to subjugate the North. When we hold council, they will have a seat at the table. Sansa will have a voice. The Vale, too. I want to break the cycle, Jon." He studied her eyes, searching for any sign of doubt or cruelty. Whatever he saw seemed to ease his tension, and he nodded again. "We'll do it together," he said softly, then turned to continue helping the wounded. Daenerys lingered a moment, watching him. She wondered if they could ever truly find peace in the aftermath of such devastation. Still, there was no time to dwell on such thoughts. Many tasks remained: executing justice, mending the city, feeding the survivors. And beyond that, forging a new realm where the wheel was broken and no single house held absolute power over the rest. The day wore on. By dusk, Daenerys had gathered her principal advisors: Tyrion, Varys, Davos, Grey Worm, Missandei, and Jon, in what remained of the Red Keep's large council chamber. The once opulent room bore scorch marks on the ceiling, and its marble floors were smeared with soot and dried blood. A broken candelabrum leaned drunkenly in a corner. Still, it offered enough space for them to convene without interruption. She took her seat at the head of a long, pitted table. Tyrion stood at her right, arms folded, brow furrowed in thought. Varys, subdued by the horrors he had witnessed, hovered close, his fingers steepled. Missandei's gaze lingered on Daenerys with unwavering loyalty, while Grey Worm remained stoic as ever. Davos and Jon both wore the expressions of men overwhelmed by the scale of the task ahead. "Cersei is in custody," Daenerys began, voice echoing in the silent chamber. "Jaime as well. The question is, what do we do next? A formal trial? An execution? The realm cries out for justice, but we must ensure we do not appear as conquerors thirsting for blood." Tyrion let out a weary sigh. "Public sentiment is complicated, Your Grace. Many in King's Landing despised Cersei for her tyranny, but they also fear us. If you simply execute her without a trial, rumors will spread that you're no better than your father. That might sow seeds of rebellion in the future." Davos nodded. "A trial might grant the people some sense of closure. Let them hear the charges, the evidence. Let them see that you offer more than vengeance." If we rush to kill her, we risk creating a martyr in the eyes of those still loyal to House Lannister. Missandei spoke up, her voice calm and clear. A public trial could show that the new queen upholds law and order, but it could also be dangerous. What if Lannister loyalists use the event as an opportunity to strike back? Grey Worm's jaw tightened. We can handle any loyalists who think to disrupt such an event, but the risk remains. I have lost many brothers in this war. I do not relish more fighting. Varys inclined his head. Perhaps a middle path exists. We hold a trial in the capital, but we keep it brief and well-guarded. Announce it widely so that lords from all corners might attend and witness. If there are still those who fear Daenerys' intentions, seeing a lawful proceeding may assuage them. Jon spoke quietly. Such a gathering might also give the North and other kingdoms a chance to bring forth their own grievances. It could be an opportunity for reconciliation, or it could ignite a feud. Either way, it seems we must risk it if we want to rebuild trust. Daenerys listened, weighing their words. She did not truly want to see Cersei Lannister grandstanding in a public forum, spewing venom and lies. Yet she recognized the political necessity of transparency. "Very well," she said at length. "We will conduct a public trial. Tyrion, you will prepare the charges. Davos, I want you to speak for the realm's victims, as you have seen firsthand the cost of her reign. Jon, you will stand as a witness for the North. Varys, ensure word spreads swiftly to the major houses, those not already in our camp." He paused, glancing around the table. "Until then, keep the city stable. Grey Worm, have the Unsullied maintain order, but I will not tolerate the abuse of civilians. Make that clear to the Dothraki as well. We did not come to King's Landing to become tyrants." Grey Worm saluted, crossing his fist over his chest. The others murmured their agreement. Daenerys allowed herself a moment to close her eyes, feeling the weight of their gazes. She was queen now, or near enough, but the peace she had promised was fragile, as delicate as a bird's egg perched on a precipice. One misstep, and everything she had fought for would crack and fall. When the meeting ended, she lingered, letting her advisors depart to their various tasks. Tyrion stayed behind, his expression somber. "I've sent for some of the maesters to tend to Ser Jaime," he said quietly. "And to Cersei as well, if she'll allow it. She's refused food so far." Daenerys nodded. "We cannot force her to eat, though I won't have her dying before she faces justice." Tyrion bowed his head in gratitude, then hesitated. "And Lord Baelish?" he asked. "Will he survive? I know he's a snake in many ways, but he did open the gates." She thought of Peter's still form, the color drained from his cheeks. "The maesters say he might pull through if the wound doesn't fester. He lost a lot of blood. I find myself hoping he does live. He's cunning, and Westeros needs cunning as much as it needs honor, if we're to rebuild." Tyrion studied her, an odd smile tugging at his lips. "Strange how things turn, isn't it? You forging alliances with men once deemed untrustworthy. But perhaps that is the nature of rule." She said nothing, only nodded. He left, leaving her alone in the half-ruined chamber. The flickering torchlight played across the scorched walls, casting dancing shadows that reminded her of the dragons she had brought to these shores. She could almost feel Rhaegal and Drogon somewhere above the city, prowling the skies, watchful. A few months ago, she had believed that this moment, this city, would be the pinnacle of her triumph. Yet it felt more like a burden than a victory. She pressed a hand to her temple, willing herself to be strong. Morning dawned on a city shrouded in a haze of ash, but alive with the stirrings of hope. The clang of hammers echoed through the streets as survivors attempted to repair doors, windows, and battered carts. Small folk gathered water from the wells, distributing it to neighbors and strangers alike. The stables bustled with activity as stable hands fed and watered the horses of both conquerors and captives. Daenerys toured several districts on foot, surrounded by a detail of Unsullied who kept a respectful distance from the citizens. She saw the fear in people's eyes, but also flickers of gratitude when her soldiers helped clear rubble or deliver bread from the royal stores. Word had spread that she intended to let the city live, not burn it to the ground as Ares once planned. The Red Keep had become a temporary seat of chaos, with hallways filled by wounded soldiers, displaced servants, and anxious lords who had come to bend the knee, or to test Daenerys' resolve. Some carried half-charred scrolls or broken relics, claiming them as records of their lineages or the fortunes they had hidden away. She listened patiently to each petition, though weariness dragged at her. Missandei stood by her side, meticulously recording names and requests. Varys flitted in and out, whispering updates on who had submitted to the new queen and who might be plotting to resist. Toward midday, Tyrion approached, a grim look on his face. "Cersei has agreed to speak with you in private," he said. "She demanded it, actually. Claims she'll only speak to you alone." Daenerys arched an eyebrow. "A desperate gambit, no doubt. Do you advise I grant this request?" Tyrion hesitated. "She might be hoping to manipulate you, or to provoke you into an outburst she can use to her advantage at the trial. But refusing might make you appear afraid to face her." Daenerys set her jaw. "Very well. Show me to her cell." Moments later, she descended into the dungeons beneath the Red Keep, where cells of damp stone and rusted iron lined the corridors. The smell of mildew and stagnant water made her stomach twist. Two Unsullied flanked the door to Cersei's cell. They saluted as Daenerys approached, then stepped aside. Tyrion waited nearby, prepared to intervene if necessary. With a nod, Daenerys entered alone, the door scraping shut behind her. Cersei sat on a small wooden bench, her ankles chained to an iron ring set in the floor. She looked haggard, her hair matted, her skin pale, yet her eyes held that same fierce glint, an ember of defiance that refused to die. When she saw Daenerys, she straightened her back, as though trying to reclaim a shred of royal dignity. "You have me in chains," she said coldly. "Is that the mercy of the Dragon Queen?" Daenerys studied her for a moment. "You have slaughtered countless people in your quest to retain power. Forgive me for not giving you a comfortable chamber and a feast." Cersei's lips twisted. "Spare me the lecture. You want to see yourself as different, kinder than your father or than me. But in the end, you marched an army into King's Landing, burned our forces, and claimed the throne through blood and fear. So tell me, how does it feel? Are the cheers of the people as sweet as you imagined?" Daenerys forced herself not to rise to the bait. "I did what was necessary to end this war." "War?" Cersei repeated with a mirthless laugh. "And who started it? The moment you set foot on Dragonstone, you declared yourself queen. You allied with the Stark bastard and turned the entire realm upside down. You brought Dothraki savages to Westeros, unleashed dragons on our armies, and now you pretend to be the savior? Your father would be proud." Daenerys felt a surge of anger flare in her chest, but she kept her voice measured. "My father was mad. I am not. I did not torch this city as he wished to. You have your life only because I allowed it. Remember that." Cersei sneered, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "And do you think the nobles of Westeros will kneel so easily? They might bend now out of fear, but they'll never truly follow you. You're a foreigner, a Targaryen usurper. The North despises you, the Iron Islands want their freedom, and Dorne will never submit to another king or queen from the East. The moment you show weakness, they will revolt." Daenerys met her glare with a calm she did not fully feel. "Perhaps," she allowed, "or perhaps they will see that I have no desire to crush them under a tyrant's heel. Westeros has endured too many bad kings, too many queens who cling to power for power's sake. I will offer them a better way." Cersei's laughter was a low, bitter sound. "You truly believe that? How quaint. But you've spilled blood like the rest of us, and you'll spill more. Power is a thirst that cannot be quenched." Daenerys stepped closer, letting the torchlight cast her face in sharp relief. "I thirst for justice," she said, voice taut. "Justice for the innocents you tormented, the friends you betrayed, the realm you tried to choke beneath your cruelty. I will have that justice, through a fair trial if possible, but by fire if you force my hand." For a long moment, they stared at each other, two queens in a grim standoff. At last, Cersei looked away, her expression guarded. You may claim your justice, but you'll never wash the blood from your hands, any more than I can wash away mine. Daenerys took a step back, refusing to let the weight of Cersei's scorn settle too deeply. Your trial will begin soon. Prepare your defense if you wish, or remain silent. It matters not to me. She turned to go, pausing at the door. One way or another, this realm will be free of your cruelty. She left, the iron door clanging shut behind her. Outside, Tyrion searched her face, concern etched in his features. What happened? Daenerys shook her head, swallowing the surge of bitterness that rose in her throat. She wanted to rattle me, to paint me as no different from her or my father. She thinks fear will break my resolve. But she's wrong. Tyrion offered a small nod. Stay the course, your grace. The trial will be soon enough, and the realm will see the truth. Daenerys allowed a faint smile to curve her lips, though her heart felt heavy. Yes, she agreed softly. They will. They climbed the steps back into the courtyard, where sunlight now streamed across broken walls and scattered debris. Soldiers bustled about, delivering food rations to those in need. A group of Vale Knights, newly arrived, stood talking with Northmen, forming tentative alliances. Daenerys spotted Gendry Baratheon among them, the bastard son of King Robert, who had proven himself both a skilled smith and a loyal ally during the war against the dead. She reminded herself to speak with him soon, perhaps about legitimizing his name and giving him Storm's End. They would need loyal lords in every corner of the realm if they were to hold it together. As she crossed the courtyard, she glimpsed Peter Baelish once more, lying under a canopy where the maesters had set up a small infirmary. His face looked less pale than before, though he remained unconscious. A mixture of relief and caution stirred within her. Even gravely wounded, Littlefinger was not a man to underestimate. If he survived, she would have to decide how much trust to extend him. But in a realm filled with uncertain loyalties, a man of his talents might prove too valuable to discard outright. The day stretched on, filled with 100 small tasks of governance and triage. Daenerys met with the lords of the Stormlands who had arrived to pledge fealty, or at least to test her. She listened to the pleas of King's Landing's starving populace, arranging for grain stores from Highgarden to be distributed under guard to prevent riots. She conferred with the faith of the 7 surviving Septons, who sought to rebuild the destroyed Great September. Though she felt no kinship with the faith, she recognized its importance to much of the population. As dusk descended, she stood upon a high balcony overlooking the city. Rhaegal and Drogon soared overhead, silhouettes against a sky stained orange and crimson. From her vantage point, she could see the labyrinthine streets, the plumes of smoke from scattered fires, the ragged banners of House Targaryen that now flew from some ramparts. It struck her that she had become something akin to a conqueror indeed, though she had tried to temper conquest with mercy. Could she remain just in the days ahead? Would the realm allow her to rule in peace, or would she face constant rebellion? She sensed a presence behind her. Turning, she found Jon Snow. He stepped up beside her, looking out at the same view. For a moment, neither spoke, caught in the gravity of all they had endured. Finally, he broke the silence. You've done what many thought impossible. The city is taken. Cersei is dethroned. She drew a quiet breath. And yet, it doesn't feel like a celebration. So many dead, the city half in ruins. This is not the triumph I imagined. He nodded, gaze traveling over the broken skyline. Victory comes at a cost. We both learned that in Winterfell and again here. The question is what we do next. Daenerys' fingers curled around the stone railing. We hold this trial, show the realm a new way of ruling. After that, we rebuild. I want your help, Jon. Not just as a commander, but as someone the people trust more than me. Someone they can look to and see the values of the North: honor, loyalty, a sense of responsibility. Jon tilted his head, a troubled look crossing his features. But my blood, you know what it means. If word spreads that I'm Aegon Targaryen, some might see me as having a stronger claim to the throne. She had thought of that often. It weighed on her like a silent threat. "I don't care about the claim," she said quietly, surprising herself with the earnestness of her words. "You never asked for it. You never wanted it. Help me build a better realm, and I will gladly stand beside you, no matter your name." He exhaled, relief mingled with uncertainty. "I want the same, Daenerys, truly. But the realm whispers. They always will. Let them whisper, if that's the price of peace." She stepped closer, feeling the warmth of him in the cool evening air. "Then we face it together," she said. "No more secrets. Let them see that House Targaryen stands united, or as united as we can be in this broken world." He nodded, and for a moment, she allowed herself to lean against him, drawing comfort from his presence. Below, King's Landing's fires burned on, and the hiss of the tide against the Blackwater Bay filled the silence. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of Cersei's trial, an event that could either solidify Daenerys' rule or ignite fresh chaos. One thing felt certain. The Seven Kingdoms had reached a turning point, and all the old certainties of blood and fire were shifting. She prayed that she could guide them toward a future worthy of those who had died to make it possible. Night settled fully, wrapping the battered capital in darkness. Torches and lanterns cast flickering patterns on the rubble-strewn streets. Quietly, Daenerys descended from the balcony, returning to her chambers, once used by Cersei herself, where Missandei waited with maps and parchments. Hours of work lay ahead, planning the logistics for the trial, the security measures, and the summoning of lords. She would have to rise before dawn again. But as she crossed the threshold, she paused, a sudden memory rushing up. The house with the red door and bravos, the smell of lemon trees, a memory from her youth when she dreamed only of a simple life free from fear. She shook it off, reminding herself that destiny had carried her too far to turn back now. The realm needed a queen strong enough to usher it out of darkness. If she faltered, if she let her compassion or her exhaustion overshadow her duty, the cycle of tyranny would begin anew. So she squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and stepped into the flickering lamplight to continue the unrelenting work of a ruler who had inherited a broken realm. Let the trial come. Let the lords gather. She would face it all, and in doing so, perhaps she would finally become the queen she had always claimed to be. Morning light fell across the ravaged city, illuminating scorched stone and heaps of rubble in a gray-gold haze. The sky was mercifully clear, and the fires that once raged through King's Landing had burned themselves out or been quenched by the combined efforts of the victors and what remained of the city watch. In the Red Keep's courtyard, Daenerys Targaryen stood among her advisors, preparing for a momentous day. She wore a dark cloak over her leathers, practical attire for a queen whose realm still smoldered in the aftermath of conquest. Nearby, unsullied guards maintained a tight formation, their spears gleaming in the dawn. Small folk and soldiers alike had heard the news. Cersei Lannister would stand trial before the Dragon Queen, an event that few had believed possible. Scribes were already writing ballads about how swiftly the Lannister reign had collapsed. Some trembled at the mention of a public spectacle. Others felt grim satisfaction at the notion that the once untouchable queen would finally face justice. Daenerys herself wrestled with a roil of emotions. She had walked among the wounded, seen the devastation etched on survivors' faces. She did not revel in this spectacle, yet she saw no alternative. The realm must witness the beginning of a new order, one ruled not by private vengeance but by open justice. Tyrion Lannister approached with measured steps, his face lined with fatigue. He carried a thick sheaf of parchments, charges and testimonies, carefully compiled. Daenerys offered him a small nod, acknowledging the burden he bore. He had lost so much to this war, yet still he served. He had shaped these proceedings with painstaking care, knowing that the manner of Cersei's downfall would ripple across the Seven Kingdoms. Jon Snow arrived next, accompanied by a retinue of Northmen. Though he wore no crown, many still addressed him as the king in the north out of habit. He had spent the night encouraging the wounded and organizing the distribution of food from the surviving granaries in King's Landing. The weariness on his features mirrored Daenerys' own. He greeted her with a quiet look of solidarity, then stepped aside to speak softly with Davos Seaworth. Grey Worm, stoic as ever, marshaled the Unsullied into position. Rows of spears glinted in the morning sun, while the Dothraki milled in the lower wards, restless and ill at ease in a city of stone. Over the last day, Daenerys had repeatedly insisted that the Dothraki cease any pillaging. Their new call, Kono, had done his best to enforce discipline, but tension still simmered. The city was broken, its people battered and hungry. One spark of cruelty could ignite chaos anew. As Daenerys walked toward the Great Hall, which had been hastily cleared of rubble for the trial, she caught sight of Peter Baelish. He was lying on a stretcher at the edge of the courtyard, under a canopy rigged from tattered sailcloth. His bandages had been changed, and a maester bent over him, checking for fever. Her eyes lingered briefly on the pallor of Littlefinger's face. She could not say why she felt the urge to see him survive. Perhaps a mixture of gratitude and recognition that no one played the game of Westerosi politics better. Cunning might still be needed in the fragile days ahead. For now, he was a question mark in a world already teeming with uncertainty. She moved on. Outside the Great Hall, gathered beneath the blackened dragon carvings on the fortress walls, a crowd had assembled. It included lords from the Westerlands who had come belatedly to see the fate of their region's overlord, knights of the Vale who had marched south under Peter's urging, a scattering of Stormland bannermen, and even a delegation from Dorne, led by a cautious young noblewoman claiming distant kinship with the Martells. Curious onlookers pressed in behind them, city folk, freed servants, soldiers. In the midst of these watchers stood a contingent of King's Landing's commoners, drawn by equal parts fear and fascination. A path through the crowd opened for Daenerys and her retinue. The Great Hall's doors, battered and scorched, stood guarded by 2 lines of Unsullied. Daenerys had chosen this location for Cersei's trial partly for symbolism. The same hall in which Targaryen kings once heard petitions and in which Robert Baratheon had doled out his own brand of justice. Now it would bear witness to an unprecedented moment, one queen judging another under the watchful eyes of half the realm. Inside, the hall was dimly lit by a series of fresh torches. Much of the stained glass had shattered in the battle, allowing narrow beams of daylight to slice through drifting dust. Debris had been pushed to the edges of the hall to make room for a semicircular arrangement of seats and benches. At the far end, beneath the high dais where the Iron Throne once dominated, stood a simple wooden seat for the judge, Daenerys. The throne itself still remained behind her, a jagged symbol of the realm's history of violence. She had refrained from sitting on it since taking the city, not wishing to appear triumphant over a people who had suffered so deeply. Instead, she would deliver justice from a more modest seat, signifying that her rule was not about forging a legacy of terror. Missandei and Tyrion had spent the Earl. Why morning organizing the hall? A handful of lords waited at benches to one side, prepared to offer testimony or pass sentence. Among them sat Lord Yohn Royce of the Vale, Lord Glover of Deepwood Motte, who had followed Jon Snow south, and Lord Edmure Tully, who had arrived the previous evening from Riverrun. All of them bore the weary look of men who had seen too many battles and were wary of another. Ser Davos stood near them, speaking quietly, perhaps ensuring they understood the gravity of this proceeding. Varys, typically in the shadows, waited near a pillar, robes rustling, his face set in an unreadable mask. Even he seemed subdued. Jon Snow and Grey Worm flanked Daenerys as she took her place at the wooden seat. The assembled witnesses hushed. At a signal from Tyrion, the heavy doors at the rear of the hall swung open, and a small detachment of Unsullied marched in, escorting their prisoner. Cersei Lannister walked in chains, wrists bound before her with iron shackles. Her once golden hair was tangled, her skin pale, though she was forced to shuffle forward under guard. She carried herself with a remnant of poise, as if refusing to let humiliation break her entirely. Behind her came Jaime Lannister, limping on a bandaged leg, his hand stump concealed by a makeshift wrap. He, too, was under guard, though with fewer chains. Daenerys had granted him some clemency for his role in fighting the undead. When Cersei reached the center of the hall, an Unsullied soldier pushed down on her shoulder, compelling her to kneel. She tried to resist but could not. A murmur rippled through the witnesses. Many of them had only ever seen her in regal attire, from a distance. Now she knelt, humbled if not yet broken, staring daggers at Daenerys. Jaime was guided to a place slightly behind her, where he stood leaning on a cane, eyes downcast. Tyrion stepped forward, clearing his throat. "We gather here," he began, voice carrying through the hush, "to witness the trial of Cersei of House Lannister. She stands accused of treason, murder, the violation of truces, and numerous crimes against the realm. By will of Queen Daenerys Targaryen, we shall hear evidence, testimony, and render judgment." Cersei's nostrils flared, but she remained silent. Daenerys watched her with a carefully measured expression. She felt the weight of history pressing down, generations of kings and queens who had held trials in this very hall, often as little more than stage plays for their own vengeance. She would not let this become that. The eyes of the realm were on her. The hush grew deeper as Tyrion began reading the litany of charges. Conspiring to murder King Robert Baratheon, orchestrating the deaths of Tyrell Scions, unleashing wildfire on her own city in the past, betraying a truce intended to unite the realm against the dead, and more. Each accusation echoed through the battered hall, a reminder of how blood-soaked the past years had been. When Tyrion finished, Cersei was allowed to speak. She rose slowly, her chains clanking. The watchers tensed, some expecting a furious outburst, others anticipating tears. But her voice, though weary, was firm. "These accusations are twisted versions of events in which I was fighting for the good of the realm. My father taught me that power is the only way to protect one's family. Every act I took was to preserve House Lannister and defend the Iron Throne. Yes, I burned my enemies. Yes, I broke alliances with traitors. But who here can say they have not done the same when the knives were at their throats?" A low rumble of disapproval and anger rippled through the hall. Cersei's gaze flicked to Daenerys. "You, Daenerys Stormborn, have you not burned men alive in your quest for power? Have you not unleashed Dothraki and Unsullied on Westerosi soil, bringing foreign armies to ravage our lands? You stand in judgment of me, but your hands are stained with blood as well. So if I am guilty, are you not equally so?" Her words hung in the air. Daenerys forced herself not to flinch. She had anticipated such a strike, yet it still stung. "I have fought to free those enslaved by cruelty, to unite the realm against the undead threat," Daenerys replied evenly. "If I have spilled blood, it was to break the chains of tyranny. You fought only for yourself." Cersei's lips curled in a bitter smile. "Spare me your talk of tyranny. You wanted the throne just as much as I wished to keep it. Power is power." At that, Tyrion intervened. "We are not here to debate motivations, but to assess guilt for specific crimes. The realm has testimony." He gestured to several individuals at the side of the hall, including those who had survived the destruction of the September of Baelor, lords who had fled King's Landing after the wildfire blasts, and even a few knights who had turned their backs on the Lannisters once the undead threat became clear. Each stepped forward to recount horrors unleashed under Cersei's orders. The room listened, rapt and uneasy, as atrocities were laid bare. Lords Royce and Glover spoke of the North's betrayal when Cersei had promised aid against the dead and then withheld her forces. A trembling Septon recounted how his brothers and sisters had perished in the explosion of the Great September, set ablaze by hidden caches of wildfire. A former guard in the Red Keep, bandaged and limping, described the secret ways Qyburn had experimented on prisoners, all with Cersei's full knowledge. As each testimony concluded, the watchers muttered, faces torn between outrage and grim satisfaction. Cersei remained standing, shoulders taut. Daenerys watched her carefully. The accused queen seemed drained but unrelenting. Finally, Tyrion turned to Jaime, gesturing for him to speak. The Kingslayer looked as though he might collapse from the weight of the moment. He glanced at Cersei, then at Tyrion, then at Daenerys. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I fought by her side for years," he said. "I believed I was protecting our family, but I cannot deny that she made choices that harmed countless innocents. The wildfire beneath King's Landing, That was my father's plan, once upon a time, and then the Mad King's mania. When I killed Aerys Targaryen, it was to save this city from burning. Yet I stood by when Cersei used the same weapon. I should have stopped her. I did not. For that, I am complicit. A hush fell deeper than before. Cersei stared at Jaime as though betrayed anew. He refused to meet her gaze, tears pooling in his eyes. The watchers shifted uncomfortably. Even the lords who despised the Lannisters could not help but feel the raw heartbreak of this confession. Daenerys allowed a moment of silence before speaking. Jaime Lannister, you stand here as both witness and accused. Yet you also rode north to fight for the living, and by many accounts you acquitted yourself with honor against the dead. As queen, I have taken this into account. Jaime lowered his head. I accept whatever judgment you deem fit. Cersei, bound and trembling with fury, spat. Coward. Traitor. After all we've done, you stand there groveling for mercy. He closed his eyes, not responding. Tyrion cleared his throat again. Are there any final statements before judgment is rendered? The hush persisted. Daenerys let her gaze sweep the hall. Lords sat rigid, some pale with the memory of seeing the Red Keep's walls quake under dragonflame or the city's streets awash in blood. The small folk in the back looked on with something like awe, for never before had such a highborn queen stood trial so publicly. At length, Daenerys rose from her wooden seat, the simple act sending a ripple through the crowd. She surveyed Cersei, who stared back in defiance, and Jaime, who appeared spent. The hush stretched as though the hall itself held its breath. When I came to Westeros, Daenerys began, her voice resonating in the stillness, I vowed to break the wheel, to end the cycles of brutality and oppression that have ground this realm underfoot for centuries. One of the first steps to doing so is ensuring that those who commit atrocities answer for their crimes. Cersei Lannister, you have been found guilty by the testimony of the realm. In the name of the people you terrorized, I sentence you to die. A collective gasp rolled through the hall. Cersei's face contorted with something like panic, though she tried to hide it behind a sneer. Daenerys continued, her tone firm. But I will not see you burned alive, nor will I feed you to my dragons. That is not the justice we seek. You will instead face a swift, clean death. No spectacle, no torture. Merely an end, here and now, that the realm might move forward. Tyrion's shoulders sagged, relief and sorrow warring in his eyes. Lord Glover and Lord Royce exchanged looks. The onlookers in the hall began to murmur and shuffle. Some were hungry for a more brutal execution after so much suffering. Others looked relieved that the city would be spared further displays of horror. Jaime, trembling, seemed on the verge of speaking but could not. Cersei drew a sharp breath. For a moment, she appeared ready to rail or plead. Then she simply laughed, a low and bitter sound echoing in the gloom. So this is how it ends, she said. All your talk of a better world. Yet you still kill those who stand in your way. Power is power, Daenerys Targaryen. You can drape it in all the noble words you like. Daenerys's jaw tightened. She nodded to Grey Worm. The unsullied captain stepped forward. Two more unsullied seized Cersei, forcing her to her knees again. A hush fell, laden with tension. Somewhere near the door, a child whimpered. Daenerys raised a hand, halting the final blow. The hush deepened to a painful intensity. Cersei Lannister, Daenerys declared, the realm has demanded your death, so be it. May you find whatever mercy the gods choose to grant in the world beyond. Grey Worm unsheathed a short sword. Cersei's eyes flicked to Jaime, who stood rooted to the spot, tears on his cheeks. Tyrion turned away, shoulders trembling. Jon Snow averted his gaze, his features grim. The blade flashed. In a heartbeat, it was done. A collective exhalation swept through the room, and Cersei Lannister slumped. Her life ended in a single, sharp moment that felt both abrupt and inevitable. Silence draped the hall. Some watchers gasped. A few averted their eyes. Others stared, as though trying to absorb the fact that the queen who had terrorized them was now nothing more than a lifeless body on the stone floor. Daenerys stood very still, her heart hammering in her chest, aware that she had just crossed a threshold. This was not the first life she had ended, nor would it be the last, but it carried a grim weight. She looked at Jaime, who sank to his knees with a ragged sob, ignoring the guards around him. Tyrion's expression was haunted, all color drained from his face. In the hush, Daenerys gestured for the Unsullied to bear the body away. A pair of them moved at once, lifting Cersei's remains and carrying them out of the hall. The crowd parted like water, some crossing themselves, others craning to see. Grey Worm wiped the blade on a scrap of cloth, then saluted Daenerys, silent in his execution of duty. She could sense how the atmosphere in the hall had changed, how the watchers grappled with a swirl of fear, awe, and perhaps the faintest flicker of hope. The old queen was gone, and a new queen reigned. Daenerys looked down at Jaime. "You fought for the living," she said quietly. "You could have fled. You chose not to. That will not erase your past crimes, but it tempers your sentence. Until I decide otherwise, you will remain under guard, assisting in the rebuilding of this city you once swore to protect. Your freedom is forfeit. Whether you can ever earn it back depends on the service you give now." He nodded numbly, too overwhelmed to speak. Tyrion placed a hand on Jaime's shoulder but said nothing. It was clear he found no joy in any part of this day. He had been brother to both the condemned and the penitent, torn between family loyalty and the realm's demands. For a long moment, he and Jaime stayed like that, motionless as the lords and small folk slowly filtered out of the hall in stunned silence. Daenerys stepped down from the dais, walking briskly to the side exit that led into the Red Keep's corridors. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She felt Missandei's presence behind her, and Jon's as well, but neither spoke as they followed her. Only when they reached a quiet alcove near the courtyard did she halt, pressing a hand to her temple as if a sudden headache had seized her. Jon touched her shoulder gently. "Are you all right?" She closed her eyes, inhaling and exhaling. "I had to do it," she murmured. "All that suffering, all those she killed, I couldn't let her go unpunished. Yet it doesn't feel like a victory." He nodded, grim understanding in his face. Justice is seldom a clean triumph, or even less so. The city is still hurting. She could not keep the sorrow from her voice. "I promised them a better world, yet we stand among the wreckage of what was. Will they ever truly accept me as queen? Or will they see me only as the one who toppled their old life?" Missandei spoke softly, stepping forward. "They feared you once the way they feared the dragons. But when they see you rebuild, when they see you offer mercy to those who bend the knee, when they see your acts of compassion, they will learn. It may take time, but hearts can change. They have before." Daenerys managed a slight nod, grateful for Missandei's unwavering faith. Jon stood at her side, silent but supportive. She realized that she was no longer alone, as she had been in Essos. The burden of rule, though heavy, might be shared. Their conversation was cut short by the arrival of Ser Davos, breathing heavily from his hurried walk. "Your Grace," he said, inclining his head, "Peter Baelish has awakened. The maesters say he's lucid now. He's asked to speak with you." Daenerys exchanged a glance with Jon. She was weary, her spirit drained, but something in her stirred at the thought of Littlefinger's survival. She remembered his final act, opening the gates, saving Grey Worm's life, ensuring the city fell swiftly. That selflessness was so unlike his old reputation. She had to know why. "Take me to him," she said. They crossed the courtyard, stepping around piles of broken masonry and through rows of wounded men. Grey Worm was nearby, speaking in low tones to an officer. He saw Daenerys pass and gave a curt nod. Her gaze flicked to the destroyed ramparts overhead, recalling the ferocity of the battle that had transpired barely 2 days prior. Felt like a lifetime ago. Under the makeshift infirmary canopy, Peter Baelish lay propped on a cushion of folded blankets. He looked deathly pale, the bandages at his side stained with fresh spots of blood. A single maester hovered, pressing a damp cloth to Baelish's forehead. When Daenerys approached, the maester stepped back to allow her space. She knelt beside the pallet, regarding Peter's half-lidded eyes. Jon lingered behind her, hands folded, watchful. Baelish's lips moved, though no sound emerged at first. Daenerys leaned in, catching the faint rasp of his voice. "You have done it," he managed. "The city yours." She nodded. "Thanks in part to you. I did not expect your help in opening the gates." A wet cough escaped him, and he winced with pain. "I served my own interests. Always do. But perhaps we share an interest now, Your Grace." She studied him. Despite his mortal pallor and the obvious pain racking him, there was a flicker of cunning in those eyes. The man who had once set the War of the Five Kings into motion was not so easily changed. "You risked your life to save Grey Worm," she pressed. "That was more than self-interest." He tried a weak smirk. "Calculations can shift. A single life might preserve an entire conquest. If Grey Worm died, the Unsullied might have faltered. Then, the city might not have fallen so quickly. More would die. My own life, for one." Daenerys mulled this, half-convinced, half-skeptical. Jon frowned but said nothing. "You aided me," she said quietly, "and for that I am grateful. When you recover, I will see you repaid." Baelish's breath came in shallow gasps. "Your gratitude is appreciated. But tell me, do I have a place in this new order? Or should I expect the headsman's axe once I can stand?" She let the question linger. She recalled how Tyrion had once warned her of Peter's manipulations. He had upended half the realm, scheming to climb higher than his birth would ever have allowed. Was he truly penitent, or merely wounded? Even so, it was he who had joined her cause, delivering the Vale Knights, urging the lords to side with House Targaryen. And at the last, he had opened the Red Keep's gates. Could he be a valuable ally in peacetime, or a dangerous snake? "I do not execute men who have saved my people," Daenerys answered at last, voice steady. "Nor do I close my doors to those willing to serve for the good of the realm. You will live, Peter Baelish, provided you do not betray me. Should you recover, we can discuss how you might help rebuild what has been destroyed." His eyelids fluttered, relief mingling with a cunning relief. "A wise choice. I have many connections." She looked to the maester. "Do what you must to keep him alive," she said. "He has earned that much." The maester bowed. Baelish seemed to drift into a faint, whether from pain or exhaustion. Daenerys stood, turning to Jon. He studied her face, searching for any sign that she might regret her decision. She offered a subtle shrug. "He might yet be useful," she murmured. "And if he turns on us, we will deal with it then." Jon said nothing, but she sensed his unease. Peter Baelish had a long history of self-serving intrigues that had broken entire houses. Could such a man truly serve a new queen wholeheartedly? The realm's future might well hinge on these questions, and Daenerys did not claim to have all the answers. They left the infirmary canopy and found Tyrion waiting in the courtyard. The hand's expression was somber, the lines in his face carved deep. "The crowd is scattering," he reported. "Some demanded a more public spectacle for Cersei's death, but most seem relieved. There's no riot, at least." Daenerys felt the fatigue in her bones, an ache that went beyond the physical. "One less war to fight," she said quietly. "But the realm still reels from the damage." Tyrion nodded, glancing toward the partial ruin of the Great Hall. "We must begin cleaning the streets, distributing what food remains. Rebuilding must start before we face the next crisis. Already, there are whispers from the Iron Islands about independence, and a new Dornish faction claims the same. I also hear that the Stormlands are fractious without a clear lord. Gendry Baratheon is forging arms for us, but has no official status. The people might rally to him as Robert's heir, or they might resent a bastard legitimized by a Targaryen queen. We must tread carefully." Daenerys inhaled, wishing for an easy solution. None presented itself. "We'll handle them one at a time," she said at last. "The realm has endured the dead, Lannister rule, and endless war. If we can show them stable leadership, perhaps they'll accept me. If not," She did not finish the sentence, but Tyrion caught the implication. The queen could not allow the realm to fracture into petty kingdoms, or all their sacrifices against the Night King would be for naught. They had to hold Westeros together, by persuasion where possible, by force if no other means remained. The wheel would be broken or hammered into a shape that served all. They moved toward the gates of the Red Keep, stepping carefully around fallen timbers and jagged stones. On the other side, in a cleared portion of the courtyard, lords and ladies had begun gathering in small clusters, discussing the day's events. Some approached Daenerys warily, bowing or curtsying, expressions conflicted. Lord Edmure Tully stood near the front, his posture tentative. When she paused to address him, he offered a respectful incline of his head. "My queen," he began, clearing his throat, "I wish to speak to you about the Riverlands. Many were devastated by the wars, both from the Lannisters and the Freys. We require resources to rebuild, men to restore order." Daenerys nodded. "We will send what aid we can spare, though King's Landing needs to heal as well. Once the city is stable, I will dispatch resources north along the roads to Riverrun." Edmure hesitated, glancing at Jon Snow. "And what of House Stark's intentions? The Riverlands have always held ties to the north, through House Tully's marriage to Catelyn Stark. Many wonder if the Riverlands might find greater support from the north than from the crown." Jon spoke up, voice courteous but firm. "We stand with Queen Daenerys. Our goal is to unify the realm, not carve it further. The Riverlands have suffered enough. You have my word, Lord Tully, that we will work together to restore your lands." Edmure studied Jon for a moment, then bowed. "Thank you." With that, he withdrew, moving to confer with other river lords. Daenerys watched him go, feeling the precariousness of the alliances forging in real time. A handful of Vale Knights approached next, discussing the question of regency for young Robin Arryn, who still resided in the Eyrie. They were uncertain whether to leave the boy in place or seek a more experienced ruler. Daenerys assured them that the Vale's internal affairs would remain mostly their own, so long as they stayed loyal and refrained from meddling in the succession without her counsel. They seemed mollified, if not entirely confident. She sensed their underlying question. Who would fill Peter Baelish's role now that he lay gravely wounded, or if he died? And so the afternoon passed in a litany of petitions, concerns, and urgent pleas. Word was sent to Gendry to request a meeting about the Stormlands. Messages were dispatched to Yara Greyjoy, who held the Iron Islands now that Euron's fleet had been largely destroyed. The Dornish delegation hovered on the periphery, not quite trusting this new queen who had arrived with dragons and turned their world upside down. Step by step, Daenerys tried to navigate a path that would weave these disparate factions into a single tapestry. As dusk crept over King's Landing, Daenerys found a moment of respite atop the ruins of one of the Red Keep's smaller towers. Much of its roof had collapsed, but a narrow ledge remained from which she could survey the city. The air tasted of smoke and salt, a reminder of how close the bay was. She stood alone for a while, listening to the distant bustle of the battered capital. Every corner told a story of pain, resilience, or the uncertain hope that tomorrow might be less cruel. A rush of wind announced the arrival of Drogon overhead. The great dragon circled once, then settled on the wide stone parapet with a rumbling growl. He stretched his wings, blotting out the last rays of the sun, before folding them at his sides. Daenerys felt a surge of warmth at his presence. The dragons had grown restless since the battles, sensing her tension and the changed atmosphere of the city. Yet here, high above the ruin, she could still sense the bond they shared, one forged in fire and tempered by loss. She reached up to lay a hand against Drogon's flank. His scales were warm, vibrating with raw power. "We've come far," she whispered. "We've lost so much, but we're still here." He turned his great head, nuzzling her gently, as if in understanding. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes, letting the comfort of that bond wash over her. When she opened them, the city lights twinkled below like scattered embers, and she thought of the countless people within its walls, each with hopes and fears she now carried on her shoulders. A presence behind her made her turn. Jon stood there, a respectful distance away, framed by the glow of lanterns from the stairwell. He seemed hesitant, perhaps not wanting to disturb her. She beckoned him closer. Drogon growled softly, but did not stir from his perch. Jon approached, glancing warily at the dragon, then shifting his focus to Daenerys. "I thought I might find you here," he said. "The day's been long." She nodded. "It has, and it seems the nights will be just as long for a while, with so much to repair." Her voice felt raw, as though she'd been speaking incessantly for days on end. In truth, she had. Jon positioned himself beside her, looking out at the city. "You did what had to be done with Cersei," he said softly. "I won't pretend I liked it, but the realm needed closure." A hollow ache filled her chest. "We ended one reign of cruelty, but the scars remain. People are frightened, uncertain. I can sense it in every glance." He weighed his words carefully. "You're not the first conqueror to take King's Landing, nor will you be the last if you rule the way those before you did. But I believe you won't. We've fought side by side against the dead. We've seen how precious life is when extinction looms. That has to change how we rule." Her gaze lingered on him. A swirl of half-formed emotions rose within her. Respect, gratitude, fear of what his lineage might mean. A flicker of something deeper that she had tried to bury. "I will do all I can to rule with compassion, Jon," she said softly. "But it's hard. The realm is fractured. The lords are suspicious, and even my own armies look to me for vengeance sometimes. The Dothraki, the Unsullied, they have lost so many. They want to see an end to their enemies." He nodded. "We need to show them a new path. Let them rebuild. Let them protect the realm instead of destroying it. That's what you do so well, turning conquerors into guardians." She almost laughed at the optimism, yet it was a comforting notion. "I hope you're right," she murmured, "because we face challenges beyond these walls. Dorne, the Iron Islands, the Stormlands, and who knows what else might stir in the shadows." Jon's jaw tightened. "We'll face them. If they won't accept peaceful negotiations, we'll outlast them. But let's not bring more fire and blood than necessary. The realm needs time to heal." She nodded, her eyes on Drogon's silhouette against the moonlight. "We walk a tightrope, Jon Snow." They stood together in silence after that, the night air cool on their faces. Far below, the city flickered with torches and lanterns, a testament to life persisting in the midst of ruin. She thought of the men and women huddled in makeshift shelters, of the children searching for missing parents, of the lords calculating alliances. So many pieces in a puzzle that felt dauntingly large. Yet she was no stranger to daunting tasks. She had once marched across the Red Waste, liberated cities of slaves, and flown on Dragonback into a battle against death itself. Tomorrow, she told herself, they would begin anew. Tomorrow, they would meet with Gendry about the Stormlands. They would speak to the Dornish envoy, try to quell the thirst for independence. They would finalize the arrangements to feed the city. They would see how Peter Baelish fared, whether the cunning mind behind so many machinations might prove an asset or a threat. They would watch Jaime Lannister's attempts to atone through service, while Tyrion wrestled with the grief of losing a sister he both hated and loved. All of it, every thread, would require care. She inhaled, tasting the salt wind from Blackwater Bay. For now, she allowed herself a moment to be still, to lean on the stone parapet with Jon at her side and Drogon's warmth behind her. Perhaps, if fortune favored them, this fragile peace could grow into something lasting, a realm free from the tyranny they had all endured. But as the moon climbed higher, Daenerys felt the pull of duty once more. She stepped back from the edge, patting Drogon's flank in farewell, and made her way to the stairs. Jon followed, and together they descended, returning to the winding corridors of the Red Keep that still bore the charred marks of dragonfire. She listened to the echoes of their footsteps, remembering how short a time it had been since she first set foot on these shores. So much had changed, yet the future remained uncertain. In the days that followed, the city stirred to life under a tenuous calm. Workers cleared debris, stacking broken stones in neat piles along the main thoroughfares. The smell of death lingered, but pyres had been lit, and the last unburied bodies were taken outside the walls for proper rites. Wheelbarrows squeaked over the cobblestones, carrying planks for repairs. The clang of hammers rose anew, forging a ragged symphony with the distant call of gulls over the bay. Daenerys spent her mornings convening with her war council, Tyrion, Grey Worm, Missandei, Jon Snow, and Ser Davos. Together, they tackled the immediate crises, ensuring that stockpiles of grain were distributed evenly, setting up basic shelter for the homeless, dispatching ravens to reassure or warn outlying territories. Letters came in response, some hopeful, others wary. Yara Greyjoy wrote from Pike that she would remain loyal to the queen who had supported her claim, if Daenerys recognized the Iron Islands' desire for a measure of independence. The new Dornish envoy pressed for autonomy as well, citing centuries of relative independence before Aegon's conquest. Each day demanded negotiation. Gendry Baratheon arrived in the city with a retinue of blacksmiths and a handful of Stormland knights. He knelt before Daenerys in the courtyard, a trifle awkwardly, declaring that he owed her a debt for legitimizing him, if indeed she intended to do so. She studied his earnest face, recalling how Robert Baratheon had once ruled. If Gendry wished to lead the Stormlands, he might be the best candidate to unify them under the Targaryen banner. She told him as much, stating that she would legitimize him as Lord Gendry Baratheon of Storm's End if he pledged to keep the Stormlands loyal to the crown. A wide grin broke across his face, tempered by the gravity of such an offer. He agreed, promising to guard the coasts, rebuild the battered castles, and uphold Daenerys' laws. Tyrion took him aside to handle the formalities. Meanwhile, the Dornish envoy sought a private audience, so Daenerys received them in a small solar. The leader was a tall, solemn woman named Lyanna Illyrian, distantly related to the extinct Martell line. She wore the colors of Dorne, gold and rust, and her dark eyes held a quiet resolve. She bowed with grace, then spoke of the tragedy that had befallen Dorne under the Lannisters, the deaths of Prince Doran, Prince Trystane, and Illyria Sand's captivity. She reminded Daenerys that Dorne had never truly bent the knee until the Targaryens offered marriages and treaties centuries prior. Daenerys listened, recalling her own time in Essos when Dorne's alliance with the Targaryen cause had seemed within reach. The Martell line was gone, but Dorne's pride remained. Lyanna proposed that Dorne be granted the right to self-govern, free from the dictates of King's Landing except in matters of mutual defense. Daenerys hesitated, seeing the precedent it might set if she allowed one region too much autonomy. Yet she also knew the Dornish were stubborn and had successfully resisted full conquest before. They might make for dangerous enemies if slighted, so she suggested a compromise. Dorne would have significant regional control, the right to elect its own rulers, but must pledge troops in case of external threats and pay taxes to the crown. Lyanna listened, her expression thoughtful. She did not commit immediately, but neither did she reject the offer. They agreed to continue talks in the coming weeks. All the while, Peter Baelish's health fluctuated. The maesters reported a fever had taken hold, but they fought it with potions and poultices. On some days, he seemed alert, muttering quiet suggestions about the Vale's needs or the intricacies of the crown's debts. On others, he fell silent, trembling under his blankets. Tyrion, curious about the man's knowledge of royal finances, occasionally visited, though Daenerys sensed he was wary of every word Baelish uttered. One afternoon, she visited as well, asking him how best to placate the Vale lords in Robin Arryn's absence. He coughed painfully, then whispered that the lords respected tradition and caution. She should not force changes too swiftly or impose southern customs on them. Then he lapsed into feverish rambling about gulls on the Ares ramparts. She left feeling unsettled, uncertain if she had glimpsed sincerity or manipulation. Jaime Lannister, meanwhile, was put to work in a more literal sense. Under guard, he helped coordinate the clearing of rubble and the reorganization of the City Watch, many of whom were leaderless after the fall of the Lannisters. Some recognized him and spat at his feet, cursing the Kingslayer who had served Cersei. Others, remembering his role in the fight against the undead, felt a reluctant gratitude. Jaime bore it all stoically, rarely speaking unless asked. Tyrion watched from a distance, anxious for his brother's safety. Daenerys reminded the guards to keep him alive and to treat him without cruelty. If he meant to atone, perhaps he deserved that chance. Cersei's death remained a source of whispered rumors. Some said that the Dragon Queen had shown too much mercy by giving her a quick end. Others claimed it was a cunning display of power, the final blow of a conqueror who had no need for spectacle. On the second evening after the execution, a small riot broke out near Flea Bottom, when a group of Lannister loyalists clashed with Dothraki warriors. Several died before Grey Worm arrived with unsullied reinforcements to quell the violence. Daenerys spent part of the night examining the bodies of the slain, her heart heavy. She realized that even with Cersei gone, the ghosts of her rule lingered, and some would never accept the Targaryen queen. Amid the swirl of ruling and rebuilding, Daenerys found fleeting moments of quiet. A dawn walk along the battlements with Jon Snow, during which they scarcely spoke but shared a burdened camaraderie. A pause in the Red Keep's gardens, where she tested the soil to see if anything still grew. A short conversation with Missandei about the life they had left behind in Essos. Each moment was precious, a reminder of humanity in a time overshadowed by politics and the aftermath of war. Some days later, a raven arrived bearing an official response from Sansa Stark in Winterfell. Daenerys read it in private, tension coiling in her gut. The letter was polite but distant. Sansa congratulated her on the victory, expressed relief that the threat of Cersei Lannister was ended, but made no promise of unconditional fealty. She reiterated the North's desire for recognition of its unique status and asked whether Daenerys had considered allowing the North to govern itself, as it once had for thousands of years. Daenerys swallowed a flicker of frustration, remembering how the North had bent the knee under Jon's leadership. But she also recalled how fiercely independent the Northerners were. To them, Southern rule was a burden they had rarely welcomed. She penned a careful reply, inviting Sansa or a representative to come south and see the city's rebuilding firsthand. Perhaps face-to-face diplomacy could ease the tension. Night fell again, and Daenerys paced in her quarters, unable to sleep. The ghosts of the day's decisions haunted her. Outside, Drogon perched on a turret, as he often did, standing watch. A single candle flickered on the table, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Missandei had retired hours ago, after finalizing letters that would go out at first light. Daenerys found herself missing the old days, when each victory felt like a step forward. Now every triumph felt tempered by regret and overshadowed by new challenges. A soft knock startled her. She opened the door to find Tyrion, face etched with worry. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, bowing slightly. "But there's something you should know." She gestured him in, surprised. "What is it?" He closed the door behind him, voice low. "Varys has been collecting whispers. Rumor has it that a handful of ex-Lannister knights and a few Golden Company stragglers are plotting to free Jaime from custody, or worse, to slay him for failing to protect Cersei. It's not clear which. Either way, they see him as an embarrassment or a target. They plan to strike soon, perhaps within the keep or when he's out on some errand. A chill coursed through Daenerys. She had no great affection for Jaime, but she had granted him a chance to atone. If he were murdered now, it would provoke chaos among those who believed in second chances, and might lead to another wave of violence. Where are these plotters hiding? Tyrion's face darkened. We're not entirely sure. Likely in the city's underbelly. Some might have fled to the outskirts. Varys says they plan to move quickly, stealthily. She thought for a moment. We should increase the guard around Jaime. Move him somewhere secure. If these knights want to kill or free him, they must not succeed. Tyrion nodded. I agree. Though if we lock Jaime in the darkest cell, we risk humiliating him further and fueling rumors. But better that than letting him be assassinated in the open. He's too valuable an emblem of your mercy, of possible redemption. Daenerys exhaled slowly. Do it quietly. Double the guard. Rotate them so they aren't bribed. If needed, keep him in the Red Keep's lower quarters, not the dungeons but somewhere we can control. And Tyrion, Be careful yourself. You're his brother. They might see you as complicit." He gave a rueful half-smile. "I'll watch my back, though I doubt they'll risk harming me. I'm the Queen's hand, and they're too few to spark a full rebellion." She placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of closeness between them. "We have come too far to let vengeance tear us apart now," she said quietly. "I need you, Tyrion, to help me keep this realm from plunging back into chaos." His eyes flicked to the floor, as though the weight of that responsibility was almost too great. "I'll do my best," he promised. "I only hope the realm is willing to meet us halfway." With that, he withdrew, leaving Daenerys alone once more in the dimly lit chamber. She massaged her temples, the beginnings of a headache pulsing behind her eyes. How many more hidden threats lurked in the alleys of King's Landing, in the halls of distant lords, in the minds of those who had lost everything? She felt the burden acutely. Her illusions of a swift and glorious victory had been stripped away by the realities of governance. The city might have fallen to her dragons, but winning hearts was another matter. Late that night, she stood at her window, listening to the distant murmur of the capital. In her mind, she saw images swirl. Cersei's final sneer, Jon Snow's determined gaze, Sansa's cautious words, Peter Baelish's feverish murmurs, Gendry's earnest pledge, the Dornish envoy's guarded eyes. Each was a piece in the puzzle of Westeros, each requiring a different approach, a different measure of trust or restraint. The dragons had given her fire and fearsome might, but they could not solve these human tangles. That task fell to her alone, guided by a devisers as flawed and weary as she was. She closed her eyes, remembering a prophecy once spoken by a sorceress in Essos, that she would be betrayed thrice, once for blood, once for gold, once for love. She had thought she understood those betrayals, but perhaps they were not yet finished. A shadow of dread flickered across her thoughts. If more betrayals lay ahead, would she hold fast to her vow of breaking the wheel? Or would the harshness of betrayal shape her into something cruel, like the rulers she despised? When she finally drifted to her bed, exhaustion tugging at every limb, she found little rest. She dreamed of a dragon coiled around the Iron Throne, wreathed in shadow. In the dream, the dragon's eyes glowed a molten gold, and its roar shook the foundations of the Red Keep until the stones tumbled away. She stood watching, powerless, as the city collapsed into a void. And then she found herself alone, the roar echoing in her ears as she fell through darkness. She woke before dawn, heart pounding. Outside, the first light stained the sky pink. She rose and dressed, for there was no time to waste in idleness. The realm beckoned, battered and in need of steady hands. She would do all she could to be that steady hand, to stand firm against the tides of vengeance and chaos. And if the storms came, she would hold true to the ideals that had carried her across seas and through battles, the ideals that made her Daenerys Targaryen, breaker of chains, mother of dragons, queen of a realm that she prayed would one day know peace. Daenerys Targaryen rose before dawn, determined to banish the nightmares that had plagued her sleep. She dressed in a simple tunic and breeches, shrugging on a light cloak to ward off the early morning chill. Though she was queen, she refused to cloister herself in the remains of the Red Keep. She wanted to see the city at first light, to remind herself of the lives she had come here to protect. She slipped past a pair of unsullied guards at the entrance to her chambers, acknowledging their bows with a nod, then made her way down a broad corridor still bearing black scorch marks on the walls. The footfalls of her escort, two more unsullied, echoed in the silence, though she had told them to keep a respectful distance. Outside, the courtyard stirred with early activity. Workers cleared broken stones, servants hauled water in sloshing buckets. A handful of maesters busied themselves tending to soldiers who had yet to heal from the final battle. Daenerys paused near a battered section of the keep's outer wall, where the sky glowed faintly pink. From this vantage point, she could see much of King's Landing, its rooftops stained with soot, its alleys still piled with debris. Smoke no longer rose in billowing columns, but drifting plumes could be seen here and there, the final remnants of fires that had devoured the city during the siege. She inhaled deeply, tasting salt and ash on the back of her tongue. For a moment, the memory of her dream tugged at her mind. A vision of a dragon coiled around the Iron Throne, roaring until the city collapsed. She forced it away. Dreams would not rule her. She would rule them, just as she must rule Westeros. She continued on, stepping through one of the half-ruined gates and into the street beyond. Her unsullied guards hurried to keep pace, worried about her safety, but she gave them a reassuring glance. They were in her city now. She could not spend her days locked away in fear. Small folk whispered as she passed, ducking their heads in a gesture that was not quite a bow. She noticed that some looked at her with cautious curiosity, others with lingering dread. Though Cersei was gone, and the streets no longer rang with Lannister boots, the memory of dragonfire striking the walls still gripped them. A butcher stood behind a makeshift stall, his apron stained with fresh blood as he cut thin slices of meat for customers. When he saw her, he froze, uncertain how to address the queen. Daenerys stopped, meeting his gaze. He stammered out a greeting, "Your Grace," and she nodded, asking how the day's business fared. He shrugged, admitted that meat was scarce and coin scarcer, yet it was better now that the fighting had ceased. She turned to one of her Unsullied and told him to see that the butcher and his fellows had access to the Red Keep's leftover stores of salted pork. The soldier inclined his head, and a flicker of relief shone on the butcher's face. She pressed on. A short walk led her to the Street of Flour, where the lingering stench of burned grain mingled with the fresh aroma of rising bread. Here, Daenerys saw that city workers were carefully repairing a trio of large ovens used to bake flat loaves for the poor. She paused to speak with the laborers, praising their efforts. One young woman, her cheeks smudged with soot, stared with something like awe at Daenerys's silver-gold hair. The queen remembered her own youth, fleeing from city to city, never imagining she would one day be in a position of such power. Soon, she reached a wide courtyard near the ruins of what had once been a grand inn. Tables and benches were arranged haphazardly, forming an impromptu distribution point for loaves of bread, dried fish, and beans brought in from the surrounding countryside. Daenerys found Jon Snow there, speaking earnestly with a cluster of Northmen and a few Stormland knights. He caught sight of her and beckoned her over. She approached, feeling a lift in her spirits at seeing him so immersed in helping the people. The Stormland knights wore the sigil of House Baratheon, newly stitched to represent their fresh allegiance to Gendry, and therefore to Daenerys's cause. Jon gestured to the stacked crates of rations. "We're preparing a shipment to the orphanages by the Dragon Pit and to the makeshift camp near the Gate of the Gods. But we could use more wagons. Word is, some wheelwrights in the city might be able to fix the old carts if we had the coin to pay them." Daenerys nodded. "We'll find the coin. Let's do it. Send a message to Tyrion. He's going to object that we're spending too much, but we can't let people starve in the streets. If the city despairs now, no alliance or plan will matter." Jon's grim expression softened briefly. "I'll send riders immediately." He moved off to relay instructions, leaving Daenerys alone for a moment. She felt a mixture of gratitude for his steady presence and anxiety for what lay ahead. The demands of the lords, the precarious alliances that might crack at any sign of weakness. Yet here and now, at least she could address a tangible need: food for the hungry. She tore her gaze from the bustling courtyard and continued her walk. By mid-morning, she returned to the Red Keep, where Tyrion and Missandei awaited her with a fresh stack of letters. The large council chamber, once a regal space, remained damaged by the siege, but they had cleared a portion of it so that a long wooden table could stand amid the rubble. Sunlight from a half-collapsed wall illuminated dust motes drifting in the air. Daenerys seated herself at the head of the table, noticing how Tyrion kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly restless. He began with the day's pressing matters: the Iron Islands. Yara Greyjoy's envoy had arrived early that morning, a young captain who delivered a parchment sealed in gray wax. Tyrion read it aloud. Yara reiterated her loyalty to Daenerys for freeing her from Euron's tyranny, but pressed for official recognition of the Iron Islands' autonomy. They wished to govern themselves, controlling their seas and pillaging rights as they had in centuries past. Daenerys grimaced at the mention of pillaging rights, but Tyrion pointed out that the Ironborn had always been a thorn. If she refused them, Yara might not break her vows outright, but her captains might well slip into old habits of raiding the coastline unless they were given some compromise. Daenerys sighed. Another region demanding special treatment. Dorne wants autonomy, the North hesitates to kneel, and now the Iron Islands. If I yield to them all, I'll no longer be queen of a united realm. If I refuse them, we might have war in a few years. Missandei spoke gently. Perhaps a series of treaties that define each region's responsibilities. The Iron Islands can keep certain rights at sea in exchange for an oath to refrain from raiding Westeros and to provide ships in times of war. Dorne can manage its internal governance but must pay taxes and come to the Crown's aid when threatened. The North can do likewise, with some measure of self-administration under Lady Sansa, if she consents. Tyrion tapped his fingers on the table. It's not a perfect solution, but a realm so wounded by war might accept a looser confederation, provided you remain the highest authority in matters of realm-wide concern. You'd be more akin to a paramount ruler than an absolute monarch. Some may question if that's truly breaking the wheel or just spinning it differently. Daenerys considered. Breaking the wheel was never about removing all rule. It was about ending the cycle of oppression that grinds the people into dust. If letting these regions govern certain affairs spares us another war, perhaps that is the better path. She paused, her voice softening. Prepare replies for Yara, for Dorne, and for the North along those lines. But leave room for negotiation. We can't cede so much power that the realm shatters. Tyrion nodded, relief in his face. Missandei jotted notes in a neat, flowing script. They moved on to the next item, the Golden Company remnants. Some had fled the city when it fell, scattering into the countryside. Rumor suggested a band of them, nearly 100 strong, were lurking near the Rosby Road, harassing travelers. Daenerys insisted they be dealt with swiftly but offered a chance for them to surrender if they laid down arms. The Golden Company might be Sellswords, yet they had a storied history. If they could be persuaded to join or simply disperse, fewer men would die. She tasked Grey Worm and a contingent of Northmen under Ser Davos to handle negotiations, and violence if needed. When the meeting ended, Missandei stepped away to draft letters, and Tyrion lingered, hesitating as if something weighed on his mind. Daenerys arched an eyebrow. "What troubles you?" He sighed. "I suspect we're nearing a tipping point with the small folk. Some resent us for the city's suffering. Others blame the Lannisters. Still others whisper about your dragons. We've done well to feed them, but that alone won't mend their hearts. And after the execution of Cersei, many fear your wrath if they displease you. Our distribution of food helps, yet there is talk that certain unscrupulous folk are hoarding or reselling rations for profit. The black market thrives even in peacetime." Daenerys rubbed her temples. "We cannot watch every corner. If we impose harsh penalties, we risk turning the city into a prison. If we do nothing, we allow exploitation. Is there a middle path?" Tyrion considered. "Perhaps we can set up a fair pricing system, enforced by the City Watch, ensuring that grain and bread must be sold at a regulated rate. Any attempt at extortion or profiteering could face fines or labor sentences rather than immediate death. Make it clear that we punish greed, not hardship." She contemplated that. "It's worth trying. Assign suitable men to oversee these price controls, men not easily bribed. Perhaps from the Vale Knights or even from the North. The City Watch must be restructured anyway. It's still riddled with ex-Lannister supporters." He nodded and left, leaving Daenerys alone in the chamber. She felt the weight of every letter, every demand, every anxious pair of eyes. She took a moment to drink some water, focusing on the sound of her own breath. She reminded herself that she was not alone. Jon, Tyrion, Missandei, Grey Worm, Davos, even Varys when he was not flitting about collecting secrets. Together, they represented a tentative government that might stabilize Westeros. If they failed, chaos would rise again. She stepped out into the hall, noticing the broken tapestries that once depicted House Targaryen's conquests. Some corners were burned away, She paused at one, half intact, showing Aegon the Conqueror astride Balerion. Once, that image might have thrilled her, but now she saw only a reminder of how power had shaped these lands in fire and blood. She clenched her jaw, then pressed on, determined to forge a kinder legacy. Outside, in a shaded courtyard, she found Ser Davos and Grey Worm conferring with a few knights about the Golden Company. Davos greeted her warmly, though his eyes were somber. "Your Grace," he said, "we're ready to ride out within the hour if that pleases you." Grey Worm stood rigid. "We will offer them terms of surrender. If they refuse, we cut them down. The Golden Company is known for cunning. We should be prepared for treachery." Daenerys nodded. "Take enough men to ensure victory if it comes to battle. But the realm has had enough killing. Tell them that if they submit, we'll grant them safe passage across the narrow sea or let them remain here peacefully, if they pledge not to bear arms against the crown." Davos glanced at Grey Worm, who simply nodded. The group marched off armed and resolute. Daenerys watched them go, a faint flutter of unease in her chest. Another test loomed. Would those Sel's words accept reason, or plunge another dagger into an already bleeding realm? She turned and made her way to the infirmary area, a row of canvas tents set up along a quieter courtyard wall. The city's Grand Maester's tower had taken significant damage. So many of the wounded were housed outdoors. Daenerys asked after Peter Baelish, curious if he had improved. A young maester led her between rows of cots, where men groaned and coughed. Some greeted her with ragged salutes, though many were too weak to notice the queen's presence. At last, she came to Baelish's cot, guarded by two Unsullied. He looked slightly better, the gray tinge having left his cheeks, though he remained gaunt. He was propped up on pillows, eyes half-lidded. At her approach, he stirred, managing a wan smile. "Your Grace," he whispered, voice raspy. "I see. The city bustles with your presence." She inclined her head. "I came to see if you were recovering." He gave a feeble chuckle. "Still breathing, so that's something. The maesters are skilled, and your men have not slit my throat. A promising start." She folded her arms, studying him. "You risked your life to ensure King's Landing fell without prolonged bloodshed. I've not forgotten that. I also remember the rumor that you once orchestrated chaos for your own gain." He sighed, coughing lightly. "I have done many things to climb the ladder, yes, but chaos now only leads to more ruin. I prefer to survive in a realm that is stable. And if you remain queen, your coin and power are worth more to me than any further plotting." She was not fully convinced, yet she saw no immediate treachery in his tired eyes. "If you recover, I might have need of your knowledge. The Vale Lords trust you more than they trust me, and you once served as Master of Coin. Tyrion can handle many tasks, but the city's finances are dire, and the crown's debts are complicated. We could use more hands, if you swear loyalty." He wheezed a small laugh. "I'll swear whatever vow you like, Your Grace, if it means I live another day. But words are wind, you know that. What would truly keep me loyal is ensuring you remain the winning side. I've no love for lost causes." She narrowed her gaze. "Then do not consider mine a lost cause." A flicker of respect touched his features. "I do not." She left him to rest, mind churning with possibilities. Had she been too lenient? Or was this the practical mercy that might help the realm heal? For now, the question had no certain answer. As she stepped from the infirmary into the bright courtyard, she spotted Jon crossing toward her, face drawn. He beckoned, and she followed him to a more secluded corner beneath a vine-covered archway. She sensed the tension in his posture. He spoke softly, as if not to alarm anyone nearby. "Tyrion just told me that Varys intercepted letters from unknown sources. Letters that mention your lineage. They speak of Aegon Targaryen, rightful heir." Her heart jolted. "You mean your lineage," she said, her voice hushed. "They claim you, not me, as the rightful heir to the Iron Throne?" He nodded, bitterness flickering in his eyes. "It seems so. The knowledge of my parentage spreads beyond the handful who knew. I don't know how. Possibly Samwell Tarly confided in someone by accident, Or maybe it's simply rumor run rampant. In any case, the letters are out there. Varys managed to retrieve a few, but we can't be sure no others were sent. Daenerys fought down a surge of panic. She remembered her pledge not to let such rumors divide them. We said we wouldn't let this come between us. But the lords, some might see you as the more acceptable Targaryen, especially after all they've heard of me in the city. He closed his eyes briefly. I never wanted the throne. I bent the knee to you willingly. But we must be ready for the possibility that factions within Westeros might try to rally around me, whether I want it or not. She bit her lip, or use it as a reason to undermine me entirely. Her thoughts raced. She had declared him her ally, had offered him a role in unifying the realm. But if even one ambitious lord decided to push him forward as king, what chaos would unfold? Another war? More blood? Jon laid a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We stand together. I will say so publicly if needed. I'll swear that I have no claim beyond what you grant me. Let them see we're united. She nodded, grateful yet still uneasy. Let's do that, but we must tread carefully. If we announce too strongly that you disclaim the throne, some will suspect I'm controlling you. If we remain silent, more rumors might flourish. We need a measured response, or we risk fracturing alliances just as we start to build them. He exhaled. I'll speak with Tyrion. We can craft a statement, or at least let people see us side by side, proclaiming the same future. They need to know we share a vision. Daenerys lifted a hand to gently clasp his, feeling the warmth of his calloused skin. I'm sorry you've been thrust into this. Perhaps it's the price we both pay for our blood. Jon's lips pressed into a thin line. It seems so. He let go of her hand, stepping back with a reluctant air. I'll prepare. In the meantime, keep your eyes open. Varys says some lords in the Reach might already be whispering about my heritage. She watched him go, a weight settling deeper in her chest. Could the realm truly unite behind one Targaryen queen if another Targaryen walked beside her? She shook off the doubt, reminding herself they had survived worse. The threat of the Night King had once loomed, and they had prevailed together. This was just another test. She threw herself into the tasks at hand, hearing petitions from minor lords, reviewing the City Watch's reorganization, discussing supply routes with the new master of ships, a Stormlander knight Gendry recommended. Hours slipped by in a blur of voices, parchments, and hurried consultations. She skipped the midday meal, too focused to be hungry, though Missandei pressed her to take at least a few sips of wine to keep her strength. Late in the afternoon, a raven arrived with news from Grey Worm and Davos. The Golden Company outlaws had refused terms. They would neither surrender nor leave the country quietly. Instead, they had tried to ambush the parley, killing 2 Northmen before Grey. Worm's spears cut them down. Most of the Sellswords were slain. The few survivors fled into the woods. Davos promised to track them, but it was likely they would scatter. Daenerys read the short missive with a grimace. More blood spilled, yet at least the threat was contained. As evening fell, Daenerys permitted herself a brief respite in the Red Keep's courtyard gardens, what remained of them. Many shrubs were blackened, trees scorched, flowers wilted. A small fountain had run dry, its basin cracked. She paced around what might once have been a rosebush, remembering the lush green spaces of Meereen and the exotic plants of the Dothraki Sea. Here, the land felt tired, battered by the weight of too many battles. She heard footsteps and turned to see Gendry approaching, wearing simple but sturdy attire. A new hammer hung at his belt, less massive than the warhammer he'd once carried, but still a symbol of his Baratheon blood. He bowed, an awkward gesture from a man more used to the forge than courts. "Your Grace," he said, a touch breathless. "You asked to see me?" She nodded, beckoning him closer. "Yes, I wanted to discuss your role in the Stormlands. We agreed I would legitimize you as Lord Gendry Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, but the formalities must be seen to. We need a public ceremony, in front of Stormland knights and other lords. It would solidify your position and reassure them that the crown acknowledges you." He swallowed, expression uncertain. Of course, I'm grateful. I never expected to be a lord, let alone the lord of my father's castle. It's overwhelming. Her voice softened. I understand, but the Stormlands need a leader who respects their traditions. The people know House Baratheon, and you carry that blood. Will you accept? It means responsibility, not just forging weapons. You'll be expected to maintain order, keep a garrison, collect taxes, and support the realm in any conflicts. He straightened his shoulders. I will, Your Grace. I won't pretend I know all the rules of highborn life, but I'll try. The knights who followed me here believe in you, and so do I. She offered a faint smile. Good. We'll arrange a ceremony in a week's time, perhaps in the courtyard. I'll name you Lord of Storm's End, and you can swear your oath of fealty. After that, you should ride to the castle, see to repairs, get to know the Stormland lords. We need them on our side. He nodded, gratitude warring with a flicker of apprehension. Thank you. I'll do my best. As he left, Daenerys realized how vital such gestures were. The realm was not just an abstract idea. It was made up of houses, families, knights, small folk, all needing leadership. She would have to build a patchwork of loyalties across every corner, from the cold of the north to the heat of Dorne. If that meant legitimizing bastards, granting autonomy, forging marriages, and striking bargains, she would do it. Anything to stop the cycle of endless bloodshed. Night fell fully, torches lit around the keep, their reflections dancing on the cracked stones. Inside the war room, Daenerys gathered with Jon, Tyrion, Missandei, Ser Davos, and Varys for a late council. They spoke in low tones about the rumors of Jon's lineage. Tyrion revealed that at least one letter had reached the Westerlands, specifically the seat of House Leford at the Golden Tooth, urging them to rally behind Aegon Targaryen for the good of the realm. Another had reportedly gone to the Vale, though Varys was unsure if it reached its destination. Jon's frustration grew visible, but he kept his voice level. We'll make a statement tomorrow. I'll stand beside Daenerys in the courtyard. I'll declare that I have no claim, that I support her as the rightful queen. If lords still choose to sow discord, we'll address them directly. Davos frowned, tapping his fingers on the table. Some may say you're only renouncing the throne out of fear or manipulation, but it's better than letting rumors run wild. Daenerys glanced at Tyrion. Draft a short announcement, something that reaffirms House Targaryen's commitment to the realm, clarifies Jon's role as Warden of the North or some equivalent. We can't officially name him king in the North if we're trying to unify, but we can grant him authority over the North's day-to-day affairs. Tyrion made a face as though tasting something bitter, but he nodded. We'll walk a fine line, yes, but we can craft the wording carefully. Varys, cloaked in a robe the color of deep twilight, watched silently for a moment before speaking in his soft voice. One must wonder who is sending these letters. It may not be random. Someone with a keen interest in destabilizing your reign might have discovered Jon's parentage and chosen to exploit it. Peter Baelish is bedridden, so unless he's orchestrating from his sickbed, it could be another cunning mind. Or perhaps it's Qyburn's leftover network, or a certain group of ex-Lannister courtiers. A silence descended as they contemplated. Daenerys felt a flicker of dread. Qyburn was dead, but the Red Keep had once teemed with spies and whisperers loyal to Cersei. It would not be surprising if a handful survived. Tyrion cleared his throat. We may never know the precise source unless we catch a messenger in the act. For now, we do damage control. So, tomorrow at midday, the announcement in the main courtyard. We'll gather what lords and knights remain in the city, plus the city watch and any small folk who wish to witness. Let them see unity for themselves. All agreed, and the meeting adjourned. Daenerys rubbed her tired eyes, feeling the strain of a day that had begun before dawn. Jon hovered, as though wanting to speak privately. She gestured for him to follow her into a smaller side chamber lit by a single lantern. Once inside, she closed the door, the hush of stone walls enveloping them. She turned to face him, searching his face for the turmoil she sensed. He spoke first, voice subdued. I'm sorry this is happening. If I could erase my parentage, I would. I never wanted to be a Targaryen or a contender for the throne. She stepped closer, her gaze steady. I know, but we can't change fate. We can only shape what we do with it. And you've shown nothing but loyalty to me since we first met. He nodded, swallowing hard. I just worry that even with our words, some lords will see me as a preferable option. You've seen how they treat you, especially now that the city's half ruined. They blame you for the dragon's destruction, for the battles. They see me as the warrior who fought the Night King. I don't want that to overshadow all you've done. She studied him for a long moment. A swirl of complicated feeling rose in her chest. Gratitude, admiration, a flicker of resentment at how easily men in Westeros accepted a male figure. But more than anything, she felt the bond they'd forged during the darkest nights. We can only move forward together, she said quietly. If they try to tear us apart, we must stand firm. Promise me you won't let them sow doubt in your mind. Promise me you won't listen if they say you should be king. His eyes locked on hers. I promise. My place is by your side. He reached out and brushed her cheek gently with the back of his hand. For a moment, the weight of their responsibilities fell away, and they were just two people, battered by war and politics, clinging to the hope that they could carve out something good. She leaned into his touch, letting a soft breath escape her. But the moment shattered as a distant shout echoed through the corridor. They drew apart and Jon moved to open the door. Outside, a panting city watch guard nearly collided with him, breathless words tumbling out about an incident at the eastern gate. Something about an altercation involving Dothraki riders and a group of armed men claiming to be loyal to the old queen. Daenerys exchanged a weary glance with Jon, and they hurried off. Once more, duty called, and any personal moment vanished beneath the crush of immediate threats. They reached the eastern gate in time to find a tense standoff. Two Dothraki warriors sat astride their horses, blood dripping from their araks, glaring at four armed men wearing mismatched armor. The men had a banner with a faded lion on it, though it looked like it had been torn from a larger cloth. One was wounded in the shoulder, staggering. A circle of bystanders had formed, watching warily. Grey Worm, newly returned from his mission, stood near the Dothraki, face cold. He turned as Daenerys arrived. These men refused to relinquish their weapons at the gate checkpoint. The Dothraki tried to disarm them by force. One Dothraki was cut. We nearly lost control until the city watch arrived. Daenerys studied the four men. Their expressions were desperate, defiant. Why do you bear arms in my city? She demanded. The war is over. One of them spat on the ground. No war's over while the Targaryen usurper breathes. Cersei was our queen. Her blood cries for revenge. Jon's hand went to his sword hilt, but Daenerys raised a palm, signaling restraint. She looked again and saw how ragged the men's boots were, how hollow their cheeks. They were either deserters or survivors clinging to a hopeless cause. Lay down your weapons, she commanded. I'll spare your lives and let you leave King's Landing peacefully. Continue this and you'll die. The men exchanged looks. One of them lowered his sword, eyes flicking to the limp banner. Another scowled. We'd rather die than serve a dragon queen. With that, he lunged at the nearest Dothraki. The warrior's arak flashed, slicing him across the chest in a single fluid motion. He dropped, gasping out his last breath. The other three men cried out, but two threw down their swords in terror. The wounded one fell to his knees, pressing his hand to his bleeding shoulder. A hush fell. Daenerys's lips tightened. Another life snuffed out by foolish defiance. She stepped forward, addressing the survivors. Go. Find somewhere else to live if you can. But if you ever return to this city with hostile intent, you'll find no mercy. They needed no second bidding. They scurried away, fear stark on their faces. Jon knelt to check the dead man, but it was already too late. Grey Worm instructed some Unsullied to carry the body away. Daenerys stood in the gathering gloom, fury and sorrow battling in her chest. Would these sporadic outbursts continue, fueled by bitterness over Cersei's death? She had tried to grant them an escape. They had chosen violence. She inhaled, fighting the urge to scream at the futility of it all. Jon placed a hand on her shoulder. She tensed, then let out a slow breath. "They'd rather die for a lost cause," she murmured, eyes fixed on the blood staining the cobblestones. "How many more must fall to old loyalties?" Jon's voice was grim. "The city is free, but hearts don't change overnight. We can only keep the peace, bit by bit." She nodded, turning away from the scene. Her guards parted to let her pass. The day had worn on too long, and she felt the weight of rulership pressing on every nerve. She made her way back to her chambers without another word, ignoring the throbbing hunger in her belly. A few concerned looks passed her by, knights, servants, a group of Vale lords, but she brushed them off, too tired for more dialogue. That night, she hardly slept, pacing in the flickering candlelight. Once more, dreams plagued her, swirling with visions of dragons and shadowy figures whispering of kings and queens. She awoke drenched in sweat, heart pounding. Dawn had not yet broken, but she knew she would find no more rest. So she rose, dressed quickly, and decided to climb to one of the Red Keep's towers to watch the sunrise. Perhaps the sight of new light would grant her a sliver of hope. She made her way through the corridors, stepping over broken masonry and past flickering torches. At the top of the tower, she found an open-air platform. The wind whipped her hair as she stood at the edge, gazing out over the sleeping city. A paleness crept across the eastern sky, heralding morning. Down below, King's Landing looked like a place of ghosts, quiet and uneasy. She could imagine the thousands of souls stirring in their beds, each with their own fears, their own grudges, their own fragile dreams. The thought reminded her that soon she and Jon would stand in the courtyard to make their announcement. It would be a test of public perception, a statement that they were united, that there was no fight for the throne. She prayed it would calm the realm, not inflame it further. With a silent plea to the gods, old and new, R'hllor, the Seven, the drowned god, any that might listen. She closed her eyes and tried to envision a kingdom at peace. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned to find Missandei, bundled in a cloak against the dawn chill, her expression gentle. "I thought I might find you here," the interpreter said. "Couldn't sleep, I take it?" Daenerys shook her head. "Too much to worry about, and the city's tension lingers in my dreams." Missandei drew closer, placing a comforting hand on Daenerys' arm. "I know, but you've carried heavy burdens before. You liberated thousands in Essos. You led armies against the dead. You can lead these people now if you trust yourself." Daenerys smiled faintly, heartened by her friend's unwavering support. "Thank you. Without you, I'd have lost my resolve long ago." Missandei returned the smile. "Come, let's go prepare. The courtyard will fill soon, and the lords will want to see you looking like a queen, not an exhausted warrior." Daenerys sighed but nodded. Together, they descended the tower. She allowed Missandei to fuss over her attire, choosing a dark, regal dress lined with subtle Targaryen embroidery at the collar, somber but dignified. A wide belt cinched her waist, crafted from black leather. She drew the cloak over her shoulders, the fastenings shaped like tiny dragon heads. Tyrion arrived to escort her to the courtyard, explaining that a sizable crowd had gathered, from lords to small folk. Word had spread that an important announcement was coming. Jon would be there too, to publicly renounce any claim to the throne. They emerged onto a platform hastily erected on the main courtyard's eastern side, with a tall wooden dais that placed them above the throng. Daenerys' gaze swept over the masses. The battered remains of King's Landing's populace, lords who'd lingered in the city, knights sporting new or old sigils. Some wore expressions of curiosity, others wariness, and a few harboring resentment she could practically taste. Above, the morning sun cast a pale gold light on the broken battlements, highlighting just how scarred the Red Keep truly was. Jon stood on the dais, wearing simple northern leathers and a cloak emblazoned with the stark direwolf. Next to him, Tyrion cleared his throat, calling for attention. The crowd quieted slowly. Davos lingered at the front, near Grey Worm, who stood at attention with a line of Unsullied. To the side, Gendry hovered, wearing a half-fitted surcoat in House Baratheon's colors. Varys was in the background, watchful as ever, flanked by a pair of scribes. Ser Brienne of Tarth, newly arrived with a small band of loyal warriors, positioned herself near the dais steps in silent support. The hush that settled made Daenerys' heart pound. Tyrion raised his voice. "Good people of King's Landing, lords and ladies of the realm, we stand at the dawn of a new day, literally and figuratively. Our city has suffered, our realm has known war and death, but we gather here to affirm unity and to address rumors that have caused concern. I present to you Queen Daenerys Targaryen, protector of the realm, breaker of chains, mother of dragons." A stir went through the crowd as Daenerys stepped forward. Many bowed, some merely inclined their heads. She could feel the wave of emotion coursing through them, a mix of awe, uncertainty, even fear. Her voice carried clearly. "You have all endured the tyranny of rulers who cared little for your lives. You have known betrayal, war, hunger. I vowed to free you from cruelty, to bring a just peace. I intend to keep that vow. Yet rumors linger of another claimant, a Targaryen who might challenge my right to rule. Let the realm hear the truth from his own lips." She gestured, and Jon stepped forth, meeting her gaze with determination. He turned to the crowd. "I am Jon Snow, born in the north, once called King in the North. Some of you have heard whispers that I am, in fact, Aegon Targaryen, son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark." A ripple of shock passed through the onlookers at the directness of the claim. Jon lifted his chin. "Whatever blood flows in my veins, I stand with Daenerys Targaryen. I bend the knee. I renounce any claim to the Iron Throne. She is the queen I choose, for she has fought for all of us, against the Night King, against tyrants who would see the realm burn. I have no desire to be your ruler. My duty is to support her, to safeguard the North, and to protect these lands." Murmurs swept the courtyard. Some looked stunned, others skeptical. Daenerys spoke again, raising her voice above the rustling crowd. "Let there be no doubt. The realm needs healing, not another war of succession. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, pledges himself to me and I accept his oath. There will be no contest for the throne. He shall govern the North, just as Sansa Stark manages Winterfell, ensuring its people remain our allies. But the throne belongs not to me alone. It belongs to all of you in a sense. I rule for the good of the realm, not to crush it under heel." Her words hung in the air. She waited, heart pounding. Some faces softened with relief. Others remained inscrutable. At length, a few scattered cheers rose, cautious but real. A handful of men and women near the front sank to one knee. Gendry stepped forward and dipped his head, followed by a smattering of knights behind him. The hush that followed was not the hush of tension, but the hush of people absorbing a profound shift. Then, from near the back, a voice shouted, "Long live the Queen!" A wave of scattered applause followed, uncertain but growing. Tyrion seized the moment, stepping forth to conclude. "All lords and ladies who would keep the peace, swear yourselves now to Queen Daenerys Targaryen. Stand with us, rebuild this city and this realm, and lay down old grudges. If any still dream of bloodshed, know that we stand united against it." The reaction was mixed but trended toward acceptance. A group of Stormland knights cheered, joined by a few of the Vale men. The small folk seemed mollified, if not outright jubilant. Daenerys felt her pulse slow. This had been a risk, but it seemed to have worked, at least for now. She glanced at Jon, who offered a tight, relieved smile. They descended from the dais to a flurry of voices. Lords pressed forward to confirm their fealty, or at least to show no open hostility. Daenerys greeted them calmly, though her mind whirled with relief. In the swirl of handshakes and bows, she felt a glimmer of hope that the worst might be behind them. Perhaps rumor and rebellion would dampen if Jon himself rebuked them so publicly. But a single day's words could not wipe out all doubts. As the crowd began dispersing, Daenerys overheard mutterings of, "She'll turn on him if he threatens her power," and "the rightful king denies the throne?" Strange indeed. She realized that trust would not appear overnight. Still, they had taken a step in the right direction, offering a public stance of unity that none could honestly refute. In the days that followed, life in King's Landing found a tenuous rhythm. Distribution of food improved, the city gate enforced stricter disarmament policies, and roving patrols kept petty violence in check. Reports trickled in from the Stormlands, where Gendry's name was slowly gaining acceptance. The Vale Lords remained politely cooperative, and word from Dorne suggested they were still considering Daenerys' offer of partial autonomy. Yara Greyjoy arrived in person one afternoon, riding up the Blackwater on a small galley, wearing a grim expression but greeting Daenerys with a warrior's salute. They retired to the war room to hammer out terms for the Iron Islands cooperation. Yara insisted on minimal oversight from the crown, wanting the freedom of the seas. Daenerys, mindful of the Greyjoy taste for reaving, extracted a promise that no raids would be conducted on Westerosi shores. In exchange, she allowed them to levy a moderate tax on foreign ships passing through the Iron Islands. Though the negotiations were tense, they ended with an accord, sealed by a clasp of hands. All the while, Jon split his time between overseeing relief efforts and planning a journey back north. He wanted to inspect Winterfell, check on Sansa and the Northern Lords, ensure their readiness for the changes Daenerys proposed. He intended to reassure them that this alliance was real, that no one would force the North to bend unwillingly. Daenerys supported his trip, though she felt a pang of anxiety at the thought of him leaving the city. She valued his counsel and his quiet strength. He assured her he would return soon, possibly bringing Sansa or Arya if they chose to come south for further talks. Meanwhile, Tyrion delved into the crown's finances with a resigned grimace. War had drained the treasury, and the death of Cersei severed many of the old Lannister money-lending arrangements, some of which had been borderline extortion. Tyrion discovered that Peter Baelish's knowledge might indeed be crucial, for the crown's debts to the Iron Bank and other creditors were tangled like a ball of yarn. He visited Baelish regularly, gleaning details about hidden accounts, outstanding debts, and foreign contacts. Daenerys kept an eye on these exchanges, wary of giving Littlefinger too much influence. But the man's health remained fragile. He could barely walk unassisted. For the moment, he posed little overt threat. One evening, Daenerys found herself alone on a balcony that overlooked the city. The Red Keep's partial renovations allowed for a few areas to be used as living quarters again, though many corridors remained unsafe. The sky was streaked with fiery orange as the sun sank behind the horizon. She traced her fingers along the balcony's stone rail, recalling how, in Meereen, she had once watched the city from a similar vantage, grappling with the complexities of ruling. It struck her that no matter how many foes she defeated, new trials would always arise. True peace was not a single victory but a continual act of leadership. Footsteps announced Missandei's arrival. Her friend bowed slightly, then joined her at the railing. "My queen, the letter you requested from Highgarden arrived. The Tyrells are gone, but certain minor lords in the Reach express willingness to grow crops for King's Landing in exchange for reduced tariffs. It's a promising development. They're eager to profit from feeding the capital." Daenerys' lips curved in a faint smile. Profit can be a powerful motivator. At least it keeps people fed. She glanced at Missandei. "Any word from the north since Jon left?" Missandei shook her head gently. "Nothing yet. He's only been gone a fortnight. Ravens are often delayed by weather. I'm sure he's fine." Daenerys nodded, though a prickle of worry lingered. "And what of the Vale? Have they responded to our request to host a gathering of major lords here in King's Landing, so we can formalize this new confederation?" "A raven came this morning," Missandei said, "stating that Lord Royce will attend, as will some of the more prominent bannermen. They're cautious but see the benefit. The others, River Lords, Storm Lords, and the Dornish, are also sending representatives. It seems they're intrigued by your approach." Daenerys exhaled. "Good. One step closer to binding these wounds." She watched the deepening hues of the sunset, letting the silence stretch. Eventually, Missandei offered a small bow and left, sensing her queen's need for solitude. Daenerys stayed, letting the wind tug at her hair, heart heavy with the responsibilities of the realm. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations for the grand gathering. She had never intended to summon so many lords to King's Landing so soon after war, but the realm demanded it. Letters flew back and forth. Tyrion and Missandei organized seating, lodging, and agendas. Davos oversaw the city watch, ensuring that any visiting lords received safe passage. Varys whispered of potential conspiracies, and Daenerys prayed that no new violence would erupt. At last, the day arrived when the first contingents of lords rode into the city. The gates opened to admit processions from the Westerlands, the Vale, the Reach, the Riverlands, and more. Each group varied in size and display. Some traveled with lavish carriages, others with a handful of knights. The city bustled with excitement, tension brewing under the surface. Shopkeepers hoped to profit from so many highborn visitors, while the common folk worried about the safety of so many powerful men in one place. Daenerys arranged for a series of feasts, modest by royal standards, given the city's state, but enough to show hospitality. She had no illusions that a feast alone could unify them, but it was a start. Among the arrivals, one face stood out: Sansa Stark, accompanied by a small retinue of northern guards. Daenerys greeted her in the courtyard, observing the Lady of Winterfell's poised expression. Sansa's red hair was bound in a practical style, and her eyes shone with guarded curiosity. She dipped into a polite curtsy, and Daenerys inclined her head in response. They exchanged cordial words, Sansa thanking her for hosting, Daenerys welcoming her to the capital. The air between them held an uneasy truce. Daenerys guessed that Sansa was here to scrutinize the arrangement Jon had made, and possibly to push for greater autonomy for the North. Yet she admired the boldness with which Sansa presented herself, a woman who had endured horrors and emerged steel-spined. Others soon arrived: Lord Yohn Royce from the Vale, his thick beard bristling; Lord Glover and 2 Mormonts from the north, wearing stoic frowns; a smattering of lesser lords from the Westerlands, uncertain of their loyalties now that House Lannister was all but destroyed; an envoy from the Tarths, led by a cousin of Brienne, paying respects to the new queen; and even a representative from the Iron Bank, a tall, gaunt man named Tovis Lauren. Each arrival brought more eyes, more demands, more delicate negotiations. Daenerys stood at the heart of it, forcing her weariness aside. By evening, the Red Keep's great hall, still scarred by the siege, was filled with the chatter of lords and ladies. Torches threw dancing shadows on the walls, revealing partially mended cracks and soot stains. Long tables had been set up for a shared meal. The aroma of roast mutton and spiced wine permeated the air. At the head table, Daenerys sat flanked by Tyrion and Missandei, with Sansa on Tyrion's other side. To Daenerys's left, Varys perched, quietly taking in every conversation. A hush fell as Daenerys rose to speak, welcoming them all, acknowledging the hardships and inviting open dialogue in the days to come. When she sat, Sansa leaned in to murmur, "Jon sends his regards from Winterfell. He's ensuring the harvest and fortifications. I came in his stead to see how your new approach to governance might serve the North. I won't lie, I have doubts." Daenerys met her gaze. "I expect doubts, but I hope you'll find reason to trust that I want the North as an ally, not a subject oppressed." Sansa inclined her head, a faint smile on her lips. "I appreciate your candor. We'll see how these councils proceed. The North is wary of dragons and southern crowns, but we do wish for peace." Before Daenerys could reply, Lord Royce on the other side of the table interjected, inviting Sansa to discuss how the Vale and the North might coordinate trade routes. Sansa turned to him, the conversation shifting. Daenerys listened, quietly relieved. Perhaps an alliance between the Vale and the North would further stabilize the realm. If these lords could find common ground, everything might hold together. The feast wore on. Servants refilled cups and brought out course after course of what provisions King's Landing could muster. Despite the city's limited resources, Daenerys had insisted on showcasing what hospitality remained. Drums and a single lute provided soft music, and though it could not mask the city's bruises, it lent an air of normalcy. Daenerys partook in minimal wine, wishing to keep her head clear. She noted that some of the lords drank heavily, a sign of lingering tension. During a lull in conversation, Tyrion leaned close to Daenerys. So far, so good. No knives have been drawn. No lords have marched out in protest. That's practically a miracle by Westerosi standards. Daenerys arched an eyebrow. The night is still young, Lord Tyrion. He chuckled, swirling his wine. True enough, but a queen can hope. Across the hall, Gendry conversed with a group of Stormland knights, evidently discussing the refurbishments of Storm's End. The Mormonts sat near the northern delegates, quietly unimpressed by the southern display. Brienne of Tarth stood by a column, eyeing the gathering with guarded alertness. Sansa kept calm composure, engaging in light diplomacy with a Vale Knight who complimented her for steering the North through dark times. Missandei offered occasional clarifications when conversation drifted into Essosi references. Varys drifted between clusters, gleaning news from every whispered corner. Each part of the tapestry felt fragile yet promising. As the feast neared its end, Daenerys rose again, calling for attention. She spoke of unity, of forging a realm that served all corners. She promised that over the coming days they would hold formal councils to outline the new structure, how each region might govern itself, how they would uphold mutual defense, and how taxes would be used to rebuild. Some lords listened with caution, others with relief. She concluded by inviting them to rest and prepare for the councils in the morn. When the tables cleared, she moved through the hall, exchanging pleasantries. Lord Glover expressed guarded optimism but pressed for assurances that the North's harvest would not be overtaxed. Lord Royce reminded her of the Vale's vow if she respected their neutrality in certain local disputes. A knight from the Westerlands, House Brax, quietly asked about restitution for towns ravaged by the Dothraki. Daenerys made mental notes of each concern, determined to address them in the councils to come. She was not naive enough to believe everything would be resolved easily, but better to face each challenge in open discourse than let resentments fester in the shadows. Eventually, she found herself speaking with Sansa by a brazier near the hall's entrance, the warmth of the coals a comfort against the draft. Sansa studied her with those cool, perceptive eyes. "You speak well," she admitted. "I sense genuine intent in your words, but the North remembers broken promises. If you truly want an alliance, you'll have to prove it through action." Daenerys nodded. "Give me the chance. I'll show the North I'm not here to conquer or subjugate." A flicker of a smile touched Sansa's lips. "I'm willing to see it. Jon believes in you." Arya remains unconvinced, but if you can win over the North's hearts through your deeds, that might change in time. Their conversation was interrupted by a faint commotion near the hall's far corner. Daenerys tensed, wondering if a fight had broken out. Instead, she saw a handful of men bracing Peter Baelish, who had insisted on leaving his sickbed to attend. He looked ghostly pale, leaning on a cane, yet wore fine attire that hung loosely on his thinned frame. The hush that fell around him suggested many lords were uneasy with his presence. Too many remembered his manipulations. Baelish offered polite smiles, occasionally bowing or murmuring greetings. When his gaze found Daenerys, he inclined his head, then turned away, giving her space. She noticed Tyrion watching him warily, as though uncertain what Baelish's endgame might be. Sansa's face darkened at the sight of Baelish, her jaw tightening. She glanced at Daenerys. "Your decision to spare him, I hope it doesn't come back to haunt you." Daenerys exhaled softly. "I share the worry, but perhaps we can use his knowledge for a time. I have no illusions about trusting him fully." Sansa gave a slight nod. "Then be careful. He weaves webs you may not see until it's too late." The feast wound down. Lords retired to their assigned chambers or returned to inns in the city. Servants began clearing the remnants of food. Daenerys lingered in the hall, arms folded, staring at the battered tapestries that once glorified House Targaryen. She resolved that if she survived this precarious era, she might commission new tapestries that told a different story, one of alliances forged in hope rather than fear. Early the next morning, the councils began in earnest. A dozen lords and their retinues gathered in a large refurbished chamber. Tyrion stood by Daenerys' side at a broad table, while Sansa, Lord Royce, Lord Glover, a Stormland representative, a Riverlord envoy, and a Westerlands knight arranged themselves. A seat remained empty for Dorne, whose envoy was running late. Over the next hours, they hashed out possible frameworks for regional autonomy, tax structures, mutual defense pacts, and the question of the Iron Throne's role. The conversation often grew heated. Some lords insisted on near-complete independence. Others demanded strong central rule to keep the peace. Daenerys listened more than she spoke, letting Tyrion facilitate. When tensions rose, she intervened, reminding them all of the cost of war. To her relief, Sansa's voice was measured, occasionally backing Daenerys' points when it benefited the North. Royce, though gruff, seemed open to a compromise that protected the Vale's neutrality in internal disputes. Glover grudgingly acknowledged that the North relied on southern trade routes for goods they could not produce. The Westerlands envoy wanted stability to rebuild mines and farmland. Slowly, common ground emerged. By midday, they had outlined a broad vision. Each region would maintain its own governance but swear to abide by certain realm-wide laws. A single High Council, presided over by the Crown, would meet twice yearly to resolve disputes and coordinate on matters of war, trade, and taxation. The North would remain under Jon Snow and Sansa Stark's stewardship but pay fair taxes if the Crown supported them in harsh winters. The Vale insisted on upholding traditional feudal rights but agreed to muster knights should the realm face external invasion. The Stormlands recognized Gendry Baratheon's lordship and pledged men to defend King's Landing if needed. The Westerlands, lacking a single great overlord after the downfall of House Lannister, needed more time to choose a leader, but tentatively agreed to the same structure. All waited to see what Dorne and the Iron Islands would say, though Yara's negotiations and the ongoing talks with the Dornish envoy hinted they might join as well, on their own terms. Daenerys observed it all, heart hammering with cautious optimism. This was not the absolute rule her ancestors had wielded, nor was it the anarchic chaos that threatened the realm. It was something in between, a confederation of sorts, reliant on mutual respect. Difficult to maintain, but perhaps more humane than forcing every region beneath the dragon's claw. Afternoon melted into dusk, and the lords departed, some returning to their quarters, others roaming the city. Daenerys, exhausted, sagged against the table once they were gone, only to receive another message. The Dornish envoy had arrived, requesting an immediate audience. She steeled herself, exchanging a weary nod with Tyrion. They made their way to a smaller meeting room, Missandei in tow. The envoy, Lady Lyanna Illyrian, entered, wearing flowing silks of gold and rust. She inclined her head, her tone polite yet firm as she spoke. Dorne, she said, desired recognition of its ancient status, much as the North sought. They wished for minimal interference from the Crown, the right to conduct their own trade, and the condition that no royal forces would enter Dorne unbidden. In return, they would pay taxes at a reasonable rate and join any realm-wide defense. They were prepared to abide by any realm-wide laws that did not infringe on Dornish sovereignty. It was, effectively, the same arrangement hammered out centuries ago by House Martell and House Targaryen, though with modifications for the modern era. Daenerys listened, finding it mirrored the compromise they had just drafted in council. She offered the envoy a seat on the High Council for Dorne, a recognized seat that carried weight equal to the others. Lady Lyanna seemed pleased, though she asked pointed questions about how House Targaryen planned to enforce disputes between regions. Daenerys answered that the High Council and the Crown would mediate, preferring diplomacy over brute force. Satisfied, Lady Lyanna agreed in principle, suggesting they finalize details in the next few days. When the envoy left, Daenerys sagged into a chair, pushing her hair back from her brow. Tyrion gave her a tired grin. Remarkable. You may achieve what neither your ancestors nor Robert Baratheon managed. A realm that actually cooperates. She exhaled. I only hope it holds. It's like juggling flaming torches while riding a horse. Tyrion snorted. An apt comparison. But keep juggling, you're doing well. The next day, Yara Greyjoy formally signed an accord, swearing to keep the Iron Islands part of this confederation in exchange for certain maritime liberties. The day after, a discreet letter arrived from the Iron Bank, cautiously praising Daenerys for her stable approach and hinting they would be open to restructuring the crown's debts if her new realm truly unified. More and more, Daenerys felt the sense of building momentum, yet she could not ignore the undercurrents of dissent. Whispers persisted about Jon's heritage. A few Stormland knights questioned Gendry's legitimacy. Several lesser Westerlands lords still resented that a Targaryen queen sat the throne. And there were rumors of scattered Lannister loyalists plotting sabotage, though no concrete evidence emerged. Varys kept an ear to the ground, while the City Watch patrolled ceaselessly. In the swirl of negotiations and half-steps toward peace, Daenerys found herself thinking often of Jon and the North. Time stretched on without a raven from Winterfell. She worried he might be delayed by weather or trouble on the road. She kept the concerns to herself, presenting a calm facade for the lords. But late at night, in her chamber, she would stare at the flickering candle flame and wonder if he'd run into some unknown threat. The North was vast, and old grudges lingered, or he might have simply taken time to fortify alliances. She resolved to wait patiently, though each passing day without word gnawed at her composure. At last, on a crisp morning nearly 3 weeks after Jon had departed, a horn sounded at the city gates. Daenerys stood on the battlements, cloak whipping, G in the wind, as she watched a column approach. Northern banners flew, along with House Targaryen's sigil. Relief spread through her when she recognized Jon Snow at the head, riding beside a half-dozen northern knights. As they drew closer, she saw another figure riding near them, Sansa. Behind them trailed a modest procession of northern soldiers and supply wagons. The gates opened, the City Watch ushering them in. Daenerys hurried down to the courtyard, heart thudding. When Jon dismounted, their gazes locked, and the tension in her chest unwound. She strode forward, ignoring the curious stares of onlookers, and greeted him with a dignified smile that hid her desire to embrace him. He bowed. "Your Grace," he said, a playful gleam in his eye. "I bring news from the North." She nodded, her pulse quickening. "And a welcome sight you are. Come inside. Tell me everything." They moved to a private room, Sansa following. Jon explained that the harvest in the North was better than expected, meaning they could spare grain shipments south if the crown provided coin or trade in goods. Sansa confirmed that the northern lords, while still cautious, were willing to see how Daenerys' new confederation might function. Some rebellious whispers persisted, but the presence of White Harbor and the support of House Manderly gave strength to the cause. Arya remained at Winterfell, uninterested in southern politics. She sent only a curt note wishing them well. When they finished, Daenerys felt hope burgeon. "Good, very good. The councils here have made progress too. We're close to a framework that might hold. If the North commits, we'll have the largest pieces of the realm on board." Sansa inclined her head. "Then we'll see this new structure for ourselves, decide whether to sign. Jon suggests we do so. I'm still uncertain, but I trust him. And you, to a degree." Daenerys accepted that measured praise. "We'll do our best not to disappoint." Soon, they convened a final Grand Council with all the major lords present. The North, the Vale, the Iron Islands, Dorne, the Stormlands, the Riverlands, and the remnants of the Westerlands. Over 2 days of intense debate, they hammered out the final details. Each region would maintain its own ruler or ruling council, recognized by the Crown. The Crown would oversee defense, foreign policy, and the enforcement of realm-wide laws. A High Council would convene annually or more often in emergencies to address disputes. Taxes would be based on regional capacity, aimed at rebuilding infrastructure. Daenerys would remain queen, but more of a first among equals than a supreme autocrat. Still, all recognized her ultimate authority to call armies together in times of dire threat. Jon reaffirmed his role in the North, aligning with Sansa. Dorne agreed to a partial alliance reminiscent of older treaties. The Iron Islands kept some freedoms at sea, promising no raids on Westeros. The Vale and Riverlands signaled acceptance, while the Stormlands coalesced around Gendry. The Westerlands, lacking a single figurehead, formed a provisional council, acknowledging Daenerys until they decided on a new ruling family. On the last evening, a final ceremony took place in the throne room. Though it remained damaged, the dais was repaired enough to hold the Iron Throne, behind which stood a line of Unsullied. Daenerys ascended the steps, every nerve humming. Lords and ladies thronged below, each awaiting their turn to pledge to this new order. Tyrion read aloud the articles they drafted. One by one, the lords signed parchments or placed seals, confirming their agreement. Yara Greyjoy, Lord Royce, Lord Glover, Lady Lyanna Illyrian for Dorne, Gendry Baratheon, the Riverlands Envoy, the Westerlands Council, Sansa for the North alongside Jon. Each vow echoed in the quiet hall, each seal pressed into wax signifying a step away from the chaos of recent years. When all was done, Daenerys rose. Let it be known, we have forged a new foundation for Westeros. No longer shall we be held hostage by endless war for a single throne. We stand as a realm of allied regions, each with its own proud traditions, each united in common cause. May this be the dawn of lasting peace. The cheer that followed was not as wild as some might expect. These lords had lost too many, endured too much, but it was genuine, reverberating off the cracked pillars. Daenerys felt tears prick her eyes, remembering the long journey that had brought her here. The deserts of Essos, the dragons she'd nurtured from eggs, the battles in Meereen, the terror of facing the undead, the final siege of King's Landing. She looked at Jon, who stood quietly at Sansa's side, and saw relief mirrored in his gaze. In the weeks that followed, lords began departing the city, carrying their copies of the new accords. Daenerys oversaw the partial reconstruction of the Red Keep, intending to make it safe if not splendid, so that any who visited would see a queen mindful of the city's suffering. The small folk, slowly but surely, expressed more acceptance, especially as trade resumed and repairs spread. Peter Baelish remained under watch, providing knowledge but no sign of overt treachery, perhaps content that a stable realm offered new opportunities. Jaime Lannister continued to labor under guard, still seeking a measure of redemption. Tyrion kept a cautious eye on him. Reports arrived that the roads were safer, the tensions lessening. The Golden Company remnants had vanished or scattered. A few brigands claimed loyalty to the old queen, but they were hunted down swiftly. The City Watch enforced fair prices, and though corruption remained a threat, progress showed. People began to speak of life before the war, of futures unclouded by Dragonfire or Lannister tyranny. On a bright morning, Daenerys stood atop a newly repaired balcony, gazing over the city's rooftops, listening to the clang of hammers and the hum of daily life. She realized she could almost smell hope in the air, mixed with the sweat and dust of rebuilding. Drogon soared overhead, a shadow against the sun, no longer an omen of doom but a reminder of the power that had brought them to this point. Beside her, Jon remarked that the North would soon see its first snowfall, and that he must return to ensure harvests were stored. He invited her to come north at some point, to witness how this new alliance thrived beyond the southern lands. She turned to him, allowing a genuine smile. "I will. The people of the North deserve to know their queen is not a distant dragon perched on a throne of swords. One day soon, I'll stand beside you at Winterfell's gates, greeting them as an ally." His eyes lit with warmth. "We'll make sure to have the hearths blazing for you." They shared a quiet laugh, the future unfolding in their minds. She thought of the countless obstacles still to face. Potential rebellions, the balancing act of regional autonomy, the precarious finances, the scars in the hearts of those who had lost loved ones. Yet it no longer felt impossible. They had laid the groundwork, forged a fragile peace, and offered the realm a chance to choose cooperation instead of war. She stepped back from the balcony, taking Jon's arm as they walked inside, where Missandei and Tyrion waited with fresh scrolls of news. The day's work beckoned, decisions on trade routes, judgments on disputes between lords, the ongoing management of the City Watch. So it would be every day, as ruling was a never-ending labor. But for the first time since she set foot in Westeros, Daenerys Targaryen felt that they were not just surviving, they were building something that might endure. She remembered the dream of the dragon coiled around the throne, roaring until the city fell. Now, she envisioned a different dream. The city standing firm, the dragon at peace, the throne not a symbol of oppression but a seat of service. And in that dream, the people of Westeros, from Dorne's deserts to the icy north, walked freely, no longer crushed beneath a wheel of endless war. A faint smile touched her lips as she closed her eyes, hearing the soft conversation of her advisors and the distant hammering of masons on the keep's walls. The future remained unwritten, but for the first time in her life, Daenerys believed it could be better than the past. And that, she thought, was a triumph worth all the trials she had endured.